Hey buddy, welcome back to the quiet past. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Go ahead and get yourself comfortable now. Turn the lights down low if you haven't already. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders. Let your head sink into the pillow. Tonight we don't have anywhere to be, and there is nothing you need to do except lie there and listen. That's the whole job tonight. Just listen and let your mind drift wherever it wants to go. Before we begin, if you're new to this channel, I want to say a quiet thank you for stopping by. And if you'd like to make this a regular part of your bedtime, there's a subscribe button down there somewhere and it costs nothing. And it helps this little channel keep going so I can keep making these long, slow, quiet stories for you. That's all I'll say about that. No pressure. Just a small favor if you feel like it, and only after you've settled in. Tonight, we are going somewhere unusual. We are not going to follow one person, or one empire, or one war. Tonight we're going to wander slowly from one forgotten city to the next. Real cities. Cities that once had streets and gardens and marketplaces and children running between houses, and old men arguing about the weather, and cooking fires that filled the evening air with smoke and the smell of roasting food. Cities that, for a while, were as alive and as ordinary and as busy as any city you've ever lived in. And then one by one they were forgotten, not destroyed in a single afternoon usually, just slowly let go, abandoned, buried under grass or sand or jungle or the silt of a river that kept rising every spring until nobody remembered where the walls used to be. I want you to imagine for a moment that cities can die the way people die. Some go quickly, in violence, in fire, in the kind of ending that gets written down and remembered. But most cities, like most people, go quietly. They get smaller before they disappear. Families move away for work, or for better land, or because the water stopped coming the way it used to. A generation later, their children are living somewhere else, telling their own children only vague stories about the old place, the one with the big stone walls or the tall earthen mounds, or the canals that used to carry boats right through the middle of town. And then even those stories fade. And the wind blows sand over the doorsteps, and the trees grow up through the courtyards, and eventually there is nothing left up top to tell you that thousands of people used to live and love and worry and grow old exactly where you happen to be standing. That's what tonight is about. We're going to visit 7 of these places. Real cities, built by real people, in different corners of the world in very different centuries. We'll walk the mounds of a city on the Mississippi River that was once larger than London. We'll sit by the stone walls of a kingdom in southern Africa that Europeans, when they finally found it, refused to believe Africans had built. We'll drift out over a lagoon in the Pacific where a city of stone was built, strangely, on top of the water itself. We'll go down, deep down, into an underground city carved into soft volcanic rock in central Turkey. A hidden world where thousands of people once lived below the surface, without the sun ever touching their faces for weeks at a time. We'll walk the maze-like adobe streets of a desert city in Peru, the largest city ever built out of mud brick anywhere on Earth. We'll stand on a wind-blown island in Scotland, where a village older than the pyramids was hidden under sand dunes for 4,000 years. And we'll end, at last, in the ruins of a city so enormous, so carefully planned, that the people who built it, we don't even know their real name for themselves, and they had already been forgotten for hundreds of years before another civilization, the Aztecs, wandered into the ruins and simply gave the empty city a name of their own. Before we start walking, I'd love to know something. Wherever you are tonight, whatever city or town you're lying in right now, whatever time it is on your clock, I want you to just say it quietly in your head, or type it down in the comments if you're still awake enough to do that before you drift off. Maybe you're listening from somewhere on the East Coast, and it's already past midnight there. Maybe you're out west, and the evening is still young. Maybe you're somewhere on the other side of the world entirely, and the sun is just starting to come up outside your window. It doesn't matter where or when. I just like knowing that all of you, in all of your different cities, in all of your different time zones, are lying there together tonight, in the dark, listening to the same slow voice talk about places that don't exist anymore. There's something comforting about that, I think. Let me know where you're tuning in from tonight and what your city's story might be centuries from now when somebody else is telling it. All right, get comfortable if you're not already. Let your eyes close whenever they're ready. And let's go inside the first forgotten city, Cahokia, the city on the Mississippi. I want you to imagine standing on a wide, flat floodplain, somewhere near where the Mississippi and Missouri and Illinois rivers all come close together, in what is now the state of Illinois, just across the river from where the city of St. Louis sits today. It's the year 1050 or thereabouts. The air is thick and warm, heavy with the smell of river mud and wood smoke. And in front of you, rising up out of the flat land, is an earthen mound so large that it will still be the largest man-made structure north of Mexico almost 1,000 years later, long after the people who built it are gone. This is Cahokia. Most people in America have never heard the name, and that alone tells you something about how thoroughly a place can be forgotten, even when it's sitting less than 10 miles from a modern American interstate. Even when the mounds themselves never actually vanished, just sat there quietly in a field while history books turned their attention elsewhere. At its height, somewhere between the years 1050 and 1200, Cahokia was home to somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, depending on which archaeologist you ask. And if that number sounds small to you, I want you to sit with it for a second. Because at that same time, London had a population of somewhere around 18,000. Cahokia, a city built entirely of earth and wood by people with no written language, no metal tools, and no wheeled vehicles, was for a while one of the largest cities in the world. Let's go inside. Let's imagine what it actually felt like to live there on an ordinary evening, with nothing dramatic happening at all. The city was built around a great central plaza, and standing over that plaza was Monk's Mound, the massive earthen pyramid that dominated the skyline. It isn't called that because monks built it. Long after Cahokia was abandoned, a group of Trappist monks settled near the mound in the early 1800s and grew vegetables on its lower terrace, and the name stuck. But the people who actually built it, we call them the Mississippians now, since we don't know what they called themselves. And they raised that mound not with wheelbarrows or shovels of iron, but basket by basket, woven reed baskets of dirt carried up on the backs of ordinary people, one load at a time, over the course of generations. Modern estimates suggest the mound contains somewhere around 22 million cubic feet of earth. Try to imagine that as baskets. Try to imagine the sheer, patient, unglamorous labor of thousands of individual people, day after day, year after year, walking up a ramp with a basket of dirt balanced on a hip or a shoulder, dumping it, and walking back down for more. Picture an ordinary family living in the shadow of that mound. Their house would have been small by our standards, a rectangular structure with walls made of upright wooden posts packed with woven cane and plastered over with clay, and a roof of thatched grass. Inside, the floor was often dug down slightly below ground level, which helped keep the house cooler in the brutal Midwestern summer and warmer in the winter, since the earth itself acted as insulation. There would be a central hearth, a shallow pit for the fire, and the smoke would curl up and find its way out through gaps near the roof line, since there wasn't always a proper chimney. If you ducked inside on a cold evening, you'd smell wood smoke first, and under that the smell of corn, because corn, maize, was the foundation of everything in Cahokia, the way wheat was the foundation of bread in medieval Europe. Corn had only fairly recently become the backbone of life in this part of North America. Earlier peoples along the Mississippi had lived more on wild plants, nuts, and river fish, along with some early cultivated crops like squash and sunflowers, and a now mostly forgotten group of native grains that archaeologists call the Eastern Agricultural Complex. But sometime in the centuries before Cahokia rose, a hardier, faster-maturing strain of corn spread up from the south, and it changed everything. Corn could be grown in large enough quantities and stored through the winter in underground pits lined with grass to support a population far larger than hunting and gathering ever could. That surplus of corn is very likely the quiet, unglamorous engine that allowed Cahokia to grow into a real city in the first place, with people freed up from constant food gathering to build mounds, make pottery, carve shell beads, and specialize in other kinds of work. I want you to imagine an early autumn evening in Cahokia during harvest season. The corn has just come in from the fields that stretch out beyond the city in every direction, worked by families who live in smaller farmsteads scattered across the floodplain, and who bring their surplus into the central city to trade. Women are shelling dried corn kernels off the cob by hand, working by firelight, the sound a soft, steady clicking, kernel after kernel falling into a woven basket. Children are underfoot, some helping, some chasing each other around the edges of the firelight, their laughter carrying easily in the still evening air. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding corn into meal using a stone mortar, a slow, rhythmic grinding sound that would have been one of the most constant background noises of daily life in this city, morning and evening, in nearly every household for centuries. Think about how different that grinding sound is from the sounds that fill your evenings now. No engines. No electronic hums. No distant traffic. Just the crackle of fires, the low murmur of conversation, dogs barking somewhere across the plaza, and underneath it all, that patient, repetitive grinding of stone against stone, turning hard kernels into soft meal for tomorrow's food. It's strange to think that in a city of 10 or 15,000 people, that quiet domestic sound, repeated in hundreds of households at once, might have been one of the defining noises of the place, the way the hum of air conditioners defines a modern American summer. Cahokia wasn't only about corn and mounds, though. There is good evidence that it was also a significant religious and ceremonial center, drawing in people from a wide area of what we now call the American Midwest and South. Archaeologists have found artifacts here made from materials that had to travel enormous distances to arrive in Cahokia: copper from the Great Lakes region hundreds of miles to the north, seashells from the Gulf Coast hundreds of miles to the south, and a stone called mica brought in from the Appalachian Mountains to the east. None of these materials occur naturally anywhere near Cahokia itself. Someone, or more likely many someones over many years, carried these things here, probably trading them hand to hand along river routes and overland paths, moving slowly from one community to the next until, eventually, they ended up in the hands of Cahokia's craftspeople, who turned them into ornaments, tools, and ceremonial objects. Let's imagine, for a moment, a craftsman sitting outside his house in the late afternoon light, working a piece of that Great Lakes copper with a stone hammer, slowly cold hammering it into a thin sheet that will eventually become a repoussé ornament, maybe shaped like a falcon or a human figure. the kind of imagery that shows up again and again across what archaeologists now call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. A shared set of religious symbols that spread across much of the American Southeast during this period. His hands would be calloused and steady from years of practice. The tapping of his hammer against the copper would be a light, high, ringing sound, very different from the deep grinding of the corn mills nearby. Around him, the ordinary business of the city continues. People carrying water up from the creek in clay pots, someone repairing a fishing net made of plant fiber cordage, a group of older men sitting in the shade discussing something in low, unhurried voices. I think one of the things that's easy to forget about a place like Cahokia is that most of the time, for most of the people living there, life would have felt very much like ordinary life anywhere. Not constant ceremony, not constant awe at the great mound looming overhead, but chores and meals and small talk and minor irritations, and the particular satisfaction of finishing a task well. A woman finishing a piece of pottery and setting it carefully to dry in the sun. A boy learning to shoot a small bow, missing his target again and again before finally hitting it and feeling that little burst of pride. An old woman complaining gently that her knees ached worse this year than last, while she sat weaving a mat from river cane, her fingers moving through a pattern she'd known since she was a girl. As the sun went down over Cahokia, the whole city would have taken on a different character. Cooking fires would flare up across the settlement, dozens and then hundreds of small points of orange light scattered between the houses and out toward the farmsteads on the floodplain. The smell of roasting meat, maybe venison, maybe fish pulled from the river that morning, would mix with the ever-present smell of corn and wood smoke. Somewhere, almost certainly, there would be music, because we know from later Native American traditions across this region that drums, rattles, and flutes played an important role in daily and ceremonial life, and archaeologists have actually found flutes made of bone and cane at Cahokia and related sites. Picture a low, steady drumbeat carrying across the plaza in the evening air, not loud, not urgent, just a rhythm that people move through their evening chores to, half-consciously, the way you might hum along to something playing quietly in another room. And above all of it, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood Monk's Mound and the other, smaller mounds scattered throughout the city, each one likely serving a different purpose, some as platforms for the homes of important leaders, some as burial sites, some purely ceremonial. On top of Monk's Mound itself, archaeologists believe there once stood a large building, possibly the residence of Cahokia's paramount leader, or a temple, or both. From up there, whoever stood at the top could look out over the entire city, the plaza below, the smaller mounds arranged around it, the scattered farmsteads stretching out toward the river in the fading light, smoke rising from 1,000 different fires. We don't know that leader's name. We don't know what language was spoken in Cahokia exactly, though it was likely an early form of one of the Siouan languages, based on later Native American groups in the region. We don't have written records, because Mississippian culture, like most Native American cultures north of Mexico, didn't develop a writing system in the way we usually think of one. Everything we know comes from the ground itself, from careful excavation of house patterns, storage pits, burial sites, and the objects people left behind. It's a strange kind of knowing, piecing together an entire vanished city out of soil stains and broken pottery and the outlines of long-decayed wooden posts. And there's a certain humility in it too, because it means so much of what actually mattered to the people of Cahokia, their stories, their jokes, their private griefs. their exact beliefs about what happened after death. All of that is simply gone, beyond our reach, no matter how carefully we dig. What we do know is that Cahokia's population began to decline sometime after the year 1200, and by around 1350 or so, the city had been largely abandoned. The reasons are still debated among archaeologists, and it's very likely there wasn't one single cause but several pressures arriving together. Some researchers point to environmental strain, the surrounding land being farmed intensively for generations, deforestation for building material and fuel, possibly leading to soil erosion, and more frequent flooding of the very floodplain the city depended on for its corn. Others point to evidence of social and political stress, including a defensive wooden palisade that was built around the central part of the city at some point, suggesting growing conflict either from outside groups or from tensions within Cahokia's own society. There's also evidence of climate shifts during this period, a time historians sometimes call the transition from the medieval warm period into what would eventually become the Little Ice Age, which could have made farming less reliable across the region. Whatever the exact mix of causes, the ending, like most endings for cities, doesn't appear to have been a single violent catastrophe. There's no clear evidence of a city-ending battle, no layer of ash and destruction sweeping across the whole site at once. It looks instead like a slow unraveling. Families leaving a little at a time over decades, moving to smaller settlements elsewhere along the river systems, until the great plaza stood emptier and emptier, until the corn mills fell silent one household at a time, until finally the fires stopped being lit altogether, and the wooden buildings on top of the mounds rotted and collapsed, and grass grew up over the plaza, and the whole enormous city, the largest north of Mexico, simply became a landscape again. Hills in a field. Something a farmer might plow around without knowing why they were there. For centuries afterward, the mounds themselves became something of a mystery even to later Native American groups living in the region, some of whom had their own oral traditions about ancient mound builders, and to European settlers who arrived later and, for a long time, simply refused to believe that Native Americans could have built such enormous structures, inventing elaborate theories about lost tribes of Israel or wandering Vikings instead, rather than accept the much more remarkable truth that ordinary people, working with baskets of earth and enormous patience, had built one of the great cities of the medieval world right here on the floodplain of the Mississippi. Today, if you drive out to Collinsville, Illinois, just a short trip from downtown St. Louis, you can still climb Monk's Mound. There are wooden stairs built into the side of it now, 154 steps, and if you climb them slowly, the way I imagine you're picturing it now with your eyes closed, you'll find yourself standing on the same flattened summit where, nearly 1,000 years ago, someone important once looked out over a living, breathing city of 10 or 15 or 20,000 people, corn drying in the sun, copper being hammered into falcon shapes, children running through the plaza, an entire ordinary, complicated human world that has almost entirely vanished from American memory. But it was real. It was every bit as real as the city you're lying in tonight. And somewhere under the quiet grass of that Illinois floodplain, the outlines of that world are still there, waiting, the way all forgotten cities wait patiently for someone to remember them. There's one more feature of Cahokia worth lingering on for a moment, something that speaks to just how carefully this society tracked the passing of time. About half a mile west of Monk's Mound, archaeologists have identified the remains of what they now call woodhen, a series of large circular arrangements of tall wooden posts, rebuilt several times over the city's history, each one slightly larger than the last, that appear to have functioned as a kind of solar calendar. Standing at a specific observation post near the center of the circle, a trained observer could watch the sun rise, on the appropriate morning, directly in line with a particular marker post positioned to align with the solstices and equinoxes, allowing Cahokia's leaders and priests to track the changing seasons with real precision, timing planting, harvest, and important ceremonies according to the sun's steady, dependable movement along the horizon. Picture a small group of observers gathered there in the gray light just before dawn, breath visible in the cool morning air, waiting quietly, patiently, for the very edge of the sun to crest the horizon at exactly the right point among the standing posts, confirming that the solstice had arrived, and that it was time, once again, to begin the next round of planting or ceremony that would carry the city through another year. Evenings in Cahokia weren't only about chores and quiet domestic sounds, either. Archaeologists have found evidence throughout the wider Mississippian world of a game called chunky, played with a small, carefully shaped stone disc rolled along a smooth dirt track, while players ran alongside it and hurled long wooden poles, trying to land their pole as close as possible to wherever the rolling stone eventually came to rest. It was, by all accounts, preserved in later Native American oral tradition, taken extremely seriously, played for high stakes, sometimes even wagered on heavily by spectators, and it would have been a familiar, well-loved sight on Cahokia's open plaza on any given afternoon, young men sprinting alongside a rolling stone disc, poles flashing through the air, a crowd of onlookers calling out encouragement, laughing, arguing good-naturedly over close calls, the whole scene filled with exactly the kind of easy, competitive community energy that games have brought to public gathering spaces in nearly every human society, in nearly every century, everywhere on Earth. Let's leave the Mississippi floodplain now, and let's travel a very long way across an ocean and most of a continent to a very different kind of city, one built almost entirely of stone, without a single drop of mortar holding it together, in the hills of southern Africa. Great Zimbabwe, the stone city they said Africans couldn't build. I want you to imagine standing on a low granite hill in what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, somewhere around the year 1300. Below you, spread across a wide valley, is a city built almost entirely of stone, but not the kind of roughly stacked stone you might picture from an old fort or castle ruin. This stone is cut and fitted with such precision that the walls seem to flow, curving gently around the natural contours of the land, rising in places over 30 feet high, and built, remarkably, without any mortar at all. Every single stone is held in place purely by the skill of the person who placed it, by the careful selection of shape and weight and balance, block resting on block, for tens of thousands of blocks, across walls that together stretch for hundreds of feet. This is Great Zimbabwe, and it's worth sitting with that name for a moment, because it's actually where the modern country of Zimbabwe gets its own name from, chosen deliberately in 1980 when the nation gained independence, as a way of reclaiming a heritage that had been, for the better part of a century, stolen from its own descendants by people who simply refused to believe what the evidence was telling them. Here's what happened. When European explorers, traders, and eventually colonial settlers first encountered these ruins in the 1800s, they found a city complex of extraordinary sophistication, dry stone walls of a scale and precision that rivaled anything in medieval Europe, and they simply could not, or would not, accept that the ancestors of the African people living nearby had built it. Instead, for decades, European writers spun elaborate theories that this must have been built by Phoenicians, or by the legendary Queen of Sheba, or by some lost white civilization. Anyone at all except the Shona-speaking ancestors who actually built it and whose descendants had lived in this region continuously ever since. This wasn't just an honest mistake. It was, in large part, a deliberate act of erasure, one that served the political purposes of colonial governments who found it convenient to claim that Africans were incapable of building great civilizations, a myth used to justify the seizure of African land. It took real archaeological work through the 20th century, much of it deliberately suppressed or downplayed by the colonial government of Rhodesia, before the truth was widely accepted. Great Zimbabwe was built, entirely, by the ancestors of the Shona people, beginning around the 11th century, and reaching its height between roughly 1300 and 1450. Let's go inside, and let's imagine this city not as a mystery to be solved, but as a place where people actually lived, worked, worried, and grew old. At its peak, Great Zimbabwe was home to somewhere around 18,000 people, making it, like Cahokia on the other side of the world at roughly the same time, one of the larger cities on Earth in that era. The city sits at the center of what was once a vast trading network stretching from the interior of southern Africa all the way out to the Indian Ocean coast, and from there, by ship, to Arabia, Persia, India, and even China. Archaeologists have found Persian pottery, Chinese porcelain, and glass beads from as far away as India buried in the ruins here, alongside locally made pottery and iron tools. Picture that for a moment. A city in the interior of southern Africa, hundreds of miles from the coast, where wealthy residents might have eaten off imported Chinese porcelain, evidence of trade routes that connected this place to the wider medieval world in ways that most people never learn about in school. The wealth that built those enormous stone walls came, most likely, from two sources working together: cattle and gold. Cattle were, and remain, deeply significant across much of southern Africa, not just as food but as a measure of wealth, status, and social relationships, used in marriage arrangements and as a kind of living currency. The hills and valleys around Great Zimbabwe provided excellent grazing land, and the city's leaders appear to have controlled large herds. Gold, meanwhile, was mined in smaller operations scattered throughout the region, and funneled through Great Zimbabwe on its way to the coastal trading city of Sofala, where Arab and Swahili merchants would carry it onward by ship, eventually reaching markets as far away as the Middle East and Asia. Picture a long line of porters moving through the hills, carrying small leather pouches of gold dust and nuggets, walking dusty trade paths that had been worn smooth by generations of travelers before them, heading toward the coast, while other porters moved the opposite direction, bringing back cloth, glass beads, and porcelain. Let's imagine an ordinary family living in the shadow of the Great Enclosure, the most famous of Great Zimbabwe's structures, an oval-shaped wall enclosing an area large enough to hold several modern houses, with an inner passage and a mysterious conical stone tower whose exact purpose is still debated by historians. Most people, though, didn't live inside the grand stone enclosures. Those were likely reserved for the ruling elite, for the king and his household and important religious functions. Ordinary families lived in daga houses, round structures built from a mixture of clay, sand, and gravel, plastered smooth, and often painted with red or white designs, with thatched conical roofs made from grass bundled tightly and layered to shed the region's seasonal rains. Picture stepping inside one of these homes on a cool evening during the dry season, which in this part of the world falls during what we'd call the middle of the year. The floor would have been made of smoothed clay, sometimes polished so carefully it took on a slight sheen, almost like dark stone itself. A small fire burns in a shallow pit near the center, the smoke drifting up and finding its way out through the thatch. The air smells of wood smoke, and underneath that, the earthy smell of the daga walls themselves, and the smell of sorghum or millet porridge cooking in a clay pot set near the coals, since these grains, along with cowpeas and other locally grown crops, formed the backbone of the diet here, much the way corn did for the people of Cahokia on the other side of the world. Outside, as the light faded, you would hear the low, contented sound of cattle settling for the night in their kraals, circular enclosures built from wooden poles or stone, positioned close to the homes of their owners, both for protection from predators like lions and hyenas that still roam this region, and simply because the cattle were too valuable, too central to daily life and status, to be kept at any real distance. The soft huffing and shuffling of cattle bedding down for the night would have been one of the most familiar background sounds of an evening in Great Zimbabwe, the way the hum of traffic might be familiar to you now, so constant that most people probably stopped consciously noticing it at all. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith might still be working by firelight, since iron tools and weapons were forged locally here, the ringing sound of hammer on iron carrying across the cooling evening air, a craft that required not just physical skill but specialized knowledge passed down carefully within particular families or lineages, since ironworking across much of pre-colonial Africa was often treated as something close to a sacred art, connected to spiritual beliefs about transformation and power. I want you to pause here for a moment and think about how different this evening scene is from what most people imagine when they picture ancient Africa. A phrase that, too, often gets flattened in popular imagination into either vague savanna wilderness or simple villages, when the reality, right here in this valley, was a sophisticated city of stone architecture, international trade, specialized craftsmen, and a complex political and religious system, all built and sustained entirely by African ingenuity, centuries before any European set foot on this soil. Religion and political authority were deeply intertwined at Great Zimbabwe. The king, referred to in later Shona oral tradition by a title something like Mambo, was believed to hold a sacred, almost priestly role, serving as an intermediary between his people and Mweri, the high god in traditional Shona religious belief, as well as with ancestral spirits who were thought to remain actively involved in the affairs of the living. The famous soapstone bird sculptures found at the site, 8 of them discovered so far, each carved from soapstone and mounted on tall columns, are now believed to represent this connection between the earthly ruler and the spiritual realm, possibly depicting a fish eagle, a bird strongly associated with ancestral spirits and prophecy in Shona tradition. One of these carved birds is now featured on the flag of modern Zimbabwe, a quiet but powerful piece of continuity between the ancient city and the modern nation that eventually took its name. Let's imagine, for a moment, a religious ceremony taking place within one of the stone enclosures on a clear night, with a full moon rising over the granite hills. Firelight flickers against the smooth, curved walls. A group of elders and religious specialists gather near the base of one of the soapstone bird columns, speaking in low, measured tones, perhaps seeking guidance from ancestral spirits about an upcoming decision, a poor harvest, a dispute between neighboring communities, or simply offering thanks and maintaining the ongoing relationship between the living and the dead that structured so much of daily life and belief across this region. Outside the enclosure, ordinary residents might gather at a respectful distance, aware that something significant was happening within those walls, even if the specific details of the ceremony were reserved for those with the proper spiritual authority to take part. As Great Zimbabwe grew wealthier through the trade in gold and cattle, its builders kept adding to the stone walls, generation after generation, each ruler seemingly eager to expand and improve upon what came before. The technique used to build these walls, now sometimes called Zimbabwe-style dry stone architecture, spread outward from this central site to hundreds of smaller related settlements across the region, more than 200 of them identified by archaeologists, forming a network of related communities, all sharing this same distinctive building tradition, evidence of a broader cultural and political sphere of influence radiating outward from Great Zimbabwe at its height. But like Cahokia, and like so many great cities across history, Great Zimbabwe eventually began to decline, sometime around the mid-1400s, and was largely abandoned by around 1450, roughly a century before European explorers finally reached this part of the African interior. The reasons, once again, appear to be a combination of factors rather than a single dramatic cause. Some researchers point to environmental strain, the surrounding hills gradually deforested for fuel and building material, and to clear land for the growing cattle herds and agricultural fields needed to feed a large urban population, possibly leading to soil exhaustion and declining crop yields over time. Others point to shifting trade routes, as the gold trade that had made Great Zimbabwe so wealthy gradually moved toward new centers of power, including the rising Mutapa state to the north, which would go on to dominate the region's gold trade with the coast for the next several centuries. There is also some evidence that the local water supply may have become insufficient to support such a large concentrated population, particularly if the region experienced a period of reduced rainfall. Whatever the precise mix of causes, the pattern feels familiar by now, doesn't it? Not a single catastrophic ending, but a slow, generational unraveling. Families moving away to found new settlements elsewhere, taking their cattle and their skills and their stories with them, until the great stone walls of Great Zimbabwe stood mostly empty, tended by fewer and fewer people, until eventually the ceremonies stopped, and the fires in the daga houses went cold one by one, and the thatched roofs collapsed and rotted, leaving only the enduring stone walls standing, silent and empty, in the granite hills. For the next 4 centuries, Great Zimbabwe stood as a kind of quiet monument, remembered in Shona oral tradition, occasionally visited, its stones sometimes reused by later communities, but no longer a living city. And then, in the late 1800s, it was rediscovered by European explorers and prospectors who, as we've already discussed, spent decades refusing to attribute it to the people who actually built it. A false narrative that colonial authorities in what was then called Rhodesia worked hard to maintain, even suppressing archaeological findings that confirmed the African origins of the site, because that truth was inconvenient to a government built on the premise of African inferiority. It's only really been in the decades since Zimbabwean independence in 1980 that Great Zimbabwe has finally been allowed to be what it always was, not a mystery, not evidence of some vanished foreign civilization, but a genuine achievement of African engineering, trade, religion, and political organization, built by ordinary people, stone by carefully fitted stone, over the course of centuries. Today, the ruins are a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and if you visit, you can walk through the great enclosure yourself, running your hand along walls that have stood, without a single drop of mortar, for over 600 years. Walls that were once the beating heart of a city where cattle lowed in their kraals at dusk, blacksmiths hammered iron by firelight, and traders carried Chinese porcelain and Persian glass hundreds of miles inland from the coast, all while a false story about their origins was still. At that time, centuries away from even being invented. I want to linger a little longer on daily life here before we move on, because there's one more detail about Great Zimbabwe that I think deserves its own quiet moment. Excavations at the site have uncovered evidence of a genuinely wide range of ordinary domestic activity spread across the settlement. Spindle whorls used for spinning cotton thread, iron hoes and axe heads for farming and clearing land, grindstones worn smooth from years of processing grain, and figurines, small clay and soapstone representations of both people and animals, whose exact purpose, whether children's toys, ritual objects, or something else entirely, remains genuinely uncertain. Picture a young girl in one of the Daga houses on an ordinary afternoon, seated on the smoothed clay floor near the doorway where the light was best, carefully spinning cotton fiber into thread using a simple wooden spindle weighted with a small fired clay whorl, twirling it steadily between her fingers, the thread lengthening slowly as she worked, a skill she'd likely been learning from her mother and older sisters for years already, practiced and patient, the same unglamorous, repetitive domestic labor that quietly sustained households in nearly every one of the cities we're visiting together tonight, whether it took the shape of spinning thread in southern Africa, or grinding corn on the Mississippi, or weaving cloth on a backstrap loom along the Peruvian coast. Let's leave the granite hills of southern Africa now and travel out over open ocean, far into the Pacific, to an island city built in a place no city should really exist at all, directly on top of the water. Nan Madol, the city built on water. I want you to imagine sailing a small outrigger canoe through a maze of narrow, quiet channels, somewhere in the western Pacific Ocean, near the island of Pohnpei, in what is now the Federated States of Micronesia. It's sometime around the year 1200. On either side of your canoe, rising directly up out of the shallow lagoon water, are enormous walls built from massive columns of dark volcanic basalt stone, some of the individual stone columns weighing as much as 50 tons, stacked log cabin style, one on top of another, forming the walls of nearly 100 separate artificial islets, connected by canals, spread across roughly 200 acres of reef and lagoon just off the main island's coast. This is Nan Madol, sometimes called the Venice of the Pacific, and it remains one of the most genuinely mysterious ancient sites on Earth, not because we know nothing about it, but because so much about how it was actually built, using tools available in this region before European contact, still isn't fully understood and continues to be the subject of serious archaeological research today. Let's go inside and let's try to imagine what it would have felt like to actually live in a city built like this. A city where instead of streets, you had water, and instead of walking to your neighbor's house, you paddled. Nan Madol was the ceremonial and political center of the Saudeleur dynasty, a line of rulers who unified the island of Pohnpei under a single centralized authority sometime around the 12th or 13th century, and who ruled from this extraordinary artificial city for several centuries afterward. Unlike Cahokia or Great Zimbabwe, Nan Madol wasn't really a city for ordinary people in the way we usually think of a city, a place where thousands of regular families went about their daily domestic lives. It functioned more as a royal, religious, and administrative center, home to the ruling class, priests, and the specialized workers who served them, while most of the general population of Pohnpei continued to live in more conventional settlements on the main island itself, coming to Nan Madol for ceremonies, to pay tribute, or to conduct official business with the Saudilur rulers. Picture paddling your canoe along one of the main canals at dusk. The water here is shallow but deep enough for small boats, and it moves gently with the tide, since the whole complex sits right at the boundary between the fringing reef and the open lagoon. The basalt walls rise up around you on either side, some as high as 25 feet, built from those long, naturally hexagonal columns of volcanic stone that, remarkably, occur naturally in this shape when certain types of lava cool slowly. The same geological process that created the famous Giant's Causeway in Ireland on the other side of the world. The builders of Nan Madol quarried these columns from natural basalt formations elsewhere on Pohnpei and then transported them here, somehow, without the wheel, without draft animals, without metal tools, floating them most likely on rafts or canoes lashed together, then maneuvering these enormous, heavy stones into place using ropes, log rollers, and an enormous amount of coordinated human labor, and quite possibly ingenious use of the tides themselves. Floating stones into position at high water and letting them settle into place as the tide dropped. I want you to pause on that for a moment. 50-ton stones, moved without wheels, without animals, without iron tools of any kind, across open water, by people working with wood, rope, coral, and shell, and an intimate, practiced understanding of the tides and currents of their own lagoon. Whatever else is uncertain about Nan Madol, the sheer scale of coordinated human effort required to build it is not in question. Some estimates suggest the total weight of stone moved to construct the complex could be as much as 750,000 metric tons. Let's imagine an important religious ceremony taking place on one of the central islets, likely on Nandowas, the largest and most impressive structure in the complex, believed to have served as a royal mortuary, a place of burial and honor for the Saudilur rulers themselves. The islet is surrounded by its own inner wall of massive basalt columns, and within that enclosure stood tombs and ceremonial platforms. Torches burn along the water's edge, their light reflecting off the dark, wet stone and rippling across the surface of the canal. Priests move through the ceremony in low, chanting voices, the sound carrying strangely across the water in a way that voices on dry land never quite do, echoing softly off the basalt walls. The air smells of salt water, and underneath that of the smoke from the torches, and perhaps of turmeric, a plant that held deep ceremonial significance across much of the Pacific Islands and was used in religious rituals here on Pohnpei. Daily life for the people who actually lived and worked within Nan Madol, the priests, the attendants, the skilled craftsmen who maintained the complex, would have moved to a very different rhythm than life on dry land. Everything depended on the tide. Canoes were the only way to move between islets, and the timing of daily activities, fishing, transporting food and supplies from the main island, moving between different ceremonial sites, would all have been shaped by whether the tide was rising or falling. Picture a young attendant paddling a small canoe loaded with breadfruit and taro, staple foods grown on the main island of Pohnpei, timing his departure carefully, so the outgoing tide would help carry him through the outer channels toward the more distant islets where supplies were needed. The sound of his paddle dipping in and out of the water, a steady, quiet rhythm, would carry across the still evening lagoon, mixing with the calls of seabirds settling in for the night and the distant, constant hush of waves breaking on the outer reef that protected this whole strange, watery city from the open ocean beyond. Fish and shellfish, easily gathered from the surrounding reef and lagoon, would have made up a significant part of the diet here, supplementing the breadfruit, taro, bananas, and coconut brought over from cultivated land on the main island. Picture an evening meal being prepared on one of the smaller residential islets, fish grilled over a small fire built on a stone hearth, the smoke curling up and drifting out over the water, mixing with the salt air in a way that would have made this place smell entirely unlike Cahokia or Great Zimbabwe, entirely unlike almost anywhere else on Earth. That particular Pacific combination of wood smoke, salt water, and tropical vegetation. The rule of the Saudeleur dynasty over Pohnpei, according to the island's rich oral traditions which have been passed down and studied carefully by both Pohnpeian elders and outside researchers, was remembered as having grown increasingly harsh and demanding over the centuries, with later Saudeleur rulers reportedly imposing heavy tribute obligations and, according to tradition, exercising increasingly oppressive authority over the general population. Local legend holds that the dynasty was eventually overthrown by a culture hero named Isoklekol, who arrived at Pohnpei, according to tradition, from another island, and who led a successful uprising against the last Saudeleur ruler, establishing a new political system afterward based on a network of separate, more decentralized chiefdoms, a political structure that, remarkably, continues in modified form on Pohnpei to this day. After the fall of the Saudeleur dynasty, Nan Madol's role as an active center of political power diminished, though it continued to hold deep religious and cultural significance for the people of Pohnpei, and it was never entirely abandoned in the way Cahokia or Great Zimbabwe eventually were. But over the following centuries, fewer and fewer people maintained an active presence there, the population using and living within the complex gradually shrinking, until by the time European and American explorers, missionaries, and eventually colonial administrators began arriving in the Pacific in the 1800s and 1900s, Nan Madol had become largely a quiet, mostly uninhabited ruin, still standing in its lagoon, still regarded with deep respect, and honestly, a fair amount of caution by local Pohnpeians, who maintained strong oral traditions about the spiritual power still residing within the site, traditions that continue to shape how the site is approached and cared for even today. I think what strikes me most about Nan Madol, lying here thinking about it with you tonight, is how completely it defies the categories we usually use to think about ancient cities. It isn't built on a river floodplain like Cahokia, or in defensible highland terrain like Great Zimbabwe. It's built directly in a shallow lagoon, on artificial islands made of stone deliberately placed on top of a coral reef, by a Pacific island culture using no metal tools at all, achieving an engineering feat that still isn't fully explained, on an island so remote that most people in the world today have still never heard its name, even though it represents one of the most extraordinary feats of pre-industrial construction anywhere on the planet. Today, Nan Madol is recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's also listed on UNESCO's list of World Heritage in danger, threatened by rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and the slow, patient work of tropical vegetation, mangrove roots working their way between the ancient basalt columns, gradually prying apart stonework that has stood in that lagoon for the better part of 1,000 years. If you were to paddle through those channels today, the way we imagined doing a moment ago, you'd find many of the walls still standing, still impressive, but increasingly wrapped in mangrove roots and swallowed by jungle growth. A slow, quiet reclaiming by the same tropical environment that the Saudeleur builders once so carefully worked around. Before we leave this lagoon behind, I want to mention one more thing that archaeologists have found genuinely puzzling about Nan Madol, something that keeps this place feeling, even after decades of careful study, a little bit unsolved. Beneath one of the central islets, excavators uncovered a burial vault containing skeletal remains alongside iron tools, and radiocarbon dating suggested those iron artifacts predated any known period of sustained European contact with the island, raising real and still not entirely resolved questions about how iron, a material without any known local source or tradition of working across most of the pre-contact Pacific, ended up in that particular burial. Most researchers today lean toward more mundane explanations, perhaps limited early contact with outside traders or later disturbance of the burial site, rather than anything more dramatic. But the honest truth is that a small handful of details about this remarkable water-built city remain, even now, not fully explained. A reminder that for as much as careful archaeology has taught us about places like this, some threads of the story are simply lost, drifted away like so much else. Into the tide. Let's leave the warm lagoon waters of the Pacific now and travel to somewhere almost the complete opposite kind of place, deep underground, into the soft volcanic rock of central Turkey, where an entire hidden city was carved not up toward the sky, but down into the earth itself. Derinkuyu, the city beneath the ground. I want you to imagine standing in an ordinary-looking field in the Cappadocia region of central Turkey, somewhere around the 8th or 9th century. Above ground, there's nothing especially remarkable to see, just soft, wind-carved volcanic rock formations, the strange cone-shaped hills locally called fairy chimneys, and scattered farmhouses tending vineyards and orchards in the thin, rocky soil. But if you knew where to look, if you found the right unassuming opening in the rock, and climbed down through a narrow passage carved into the soft volcanic stone, you would descend, level after level, deeper and deeper, into an entire city built underground, eventually reaching depths of nearly 200 feet below the surface, with room after room, stable after stable, chapel after chapel, carved entirely out of solid rock, extending downward through 18 distinct levels. This is Derinkuyu, and even the name, which simply means deep well in Turkish, undersells just how strange and remarkable this place actually is. At its fullest capacity, researchers believe Derinkuyu could have sheltered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 people, along with their livestock and food stores, for extended periods of time, entirely underground with no need to surface at all. Let's go inside, and let's really try to imagine what it would have been like to live, even temporarily, in a city with no sky. The soft volcanic rock of Cappadocia, called tuff, formed millions of years ago from ancient volcanic eruptions, and it has a very particular property that made this whole underground world possible. It's soft and workable enough to carve with simple hand tools when first exposed to air, but it hardens over time once exposed to the elements. This meant that people here, going back possibly as far as the Bronze Age but expanded dramatically over the centuries by successive waves of inhabitants, particularly early Christian communities in the region during the Byzantine period, could carve out rooms, staircases, ventilation shafts, and entire multi-level complexes using nothing more than simple picks and chisels, patiently working through the rock a little at a time, generation after generation, expanding what earlier residents had already begun. Picture descending the main staircase into Derinkuyu, a narrow passage just wide enough for one person at a time, the walls close on either side, the air growing noticeably cooler with every step down. The lighting would have come entirely from small oil lamps, or later candles, carried by hand or set into small carved niches along the walls, each one casting a small, warm, flickering circle of light against the pale volcanic rock, the shadows shifting and dancing as you moved past. The air down here has a particular quality to it, cool and slightly damp, but remarkably fresh, thanks to an extraordinarily sophisticated ventilation system. More than 50 vertical air shafts drilled down through the rock from the surface, some over 200 feet deep, positioned throughout the complex to keep fresh air circulating even at the deepest levels, a level of engineering foresight that still genuinely impresses modern engineers who study the site. I want you to imagine reaching one of the upper residential levels, where ordinary families lived. These weren't cramped, cave-like holes but proper carved rooms, some quite spacious, with vaulted or flat ceilings, niches carved into the walls for storage, and in some cases, ventilation designed specifically to let smoke from small cooking fires escape upward through the shaft system rather than filling the living space. Picture a family settling in for the evening down here, the mother preparing a simple meal, perhaps a lentil stew or flatbread cooked on a small hearth, the smell of the cooking mixing with that cool mineral smell of the surrounding rock, so different from the smell of an above-ground home. A father might be tending a small oil lamp, trimming its wick carefully, since light down here was precious and had to be managed thoughtfully, not wasted. Children, if this was a temporary shelter during a time of danger rather than permanent daily life, might be restless, unused to being confined so far from open sky and sunlight, and a parent might be telling them a story, quietly, to help pass the time and ease their nerves, their voices carrying with a particular clarity in the enclosed stone space, a kind of natural acoustic quality that makes even a whisper travel further underground than you'd expect. Because that's the other crucial thing to understand about Derinkuyu. It wasn't primarily a permanent, everyday city the way Cahokia or Great Zimbabwe were. It functioned mainly as a refuge, a place where the population of the surrounding region could retreat, sometimes for weeks or even months at a time, during periods of danger, particularly during the various waves of invasion and conflict that swept through Anatolia over the centuries, including Arab raids during the 7th through 9th centuries, and later periods of instability. This explains many of its most distinctive engineering features. Massive circular stone doors, some weighing as much as half a ton, were carved to fit snugly into specially cut grooves at key junctions throughout the complex, and could be rolled into place from the inside to seal off sections of the city against intruders, essentially functioning as enormous stone plugs that could only be moved from the interior side, making forced entry from outside extremely difficult. Let's imagine a moment of real tension here, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, tense waiting that must have characterized so many of the actual periods of refuge in this underground city. Word arrives that raiders are approaching the surface villages above. Families gather their essential belongings, food stores, water containers, perhaps a few valued possessions, and make their way down into the tunnels, herding livestock, goats and cattle, down specially widened passages toward underground stables carved for exactly this purpose, complete with stone feeding troughs and tethering posts still visible today. Once everyone was safely below, those heavy circular stone doors would be rolled into place at strategic points, sealing off sections of the complex, and the community would simply wait, sometimes for extended periods, sustained by stored grain, water from deep wells that had been carved down to reach the water table, and whatever livestock had been brought down with them, until word came, eventually, that it was safe to return to the surface. Picture the particular quality of that waiting. No sunlight at all for days, weeks, in some historical cases possibly longer. Time would have been tracked mostly by the rhythm of meals, sleep, and the changing behavior of the oil lamps as fuel needed replenishing. Children who had been carried down as infants during a crisis might, in extended stays, genuinely lose track of how long they'd been underground. There's something worth pausing on here. The particular psychological weight of that kind of confinement, made bearable, presumably, by community, by shared purpose, by the deep human capacity to adapt to even strange and difficult circumstances when survival depends on it, and made bearable too by faith, since we know that many of the communities who used and expanded Derinkuyu during the Byzantine period were early Christian communities. And the underground city includes several carved chapels, and even what appears to have been a small underground seminary or school, cross-shaped in design, where religious teaching may have continued even during periods of extended shelter below ground. Let's imagine one of those underground chapels, a modest room carved with a vaulted ceiling, a simple altar space cut directly from the rock at one end, perhaps a few carved crosses or simple religious symbols etched into the walls by hands working slowly, carefully, by lamplight, over the years. Picture a small gathering here during an extended period of shelter, adults and children alike, voices raised quietly in prayer or hymn, the sound filling the small stone chamber in a way that must have felt, despite everything, deeply comforting, a reminder of continuity and faith even while hiding from danger many feet below the ordinary world of sunlight and open sky. Derinkuyu was also remarkably interconnected with the broader underground landscape of this region. A long tunnel, several miles in length, is believed to have connected Derinkuyu to another nearby underground city called Cahokia, allowing movement and communication between the two complexes, even while both were sealed off from the surface above. In fact, Cappadocia as a whole contains dozens of these underground cities and complexes of varying size, connected in places by tunnels, suggesting an entire regional network of subterranean refuge that local populations here had developed and maintained across many centuries. A hidden world existing entirely beneath the more familiar landscape of vineyards, orchards, and fairy chimney rock formations above. As the centuries passed, and the specific threats that had driven the original expansion of these underground refuges gradually diminished, particularly after the region came more fully under Ottoman control and relative regional stability took hold, the underground cities were used less and less for their original defensive purpose. Some sections continue to be used by local farming communities for practical purposes, particularly as cool storage space for food, wine, and produce, since the constant cool temperature underground, remaining fairly steady regardless of the harsh temperature swings on the Cappadocian surface between summer and winter, made it genuinely useful for preserving food long after its role as an emergency refuge had faded from urgent necessity. Remarkably, Derinkuyu wasn't even rediscovered by the wider world until surprisingly recently. Local residents in the area had long known about at least parts of the underground network, using certain sections for storage, but the true scale of the complex wasn't fully appreciated until 1963, when a local resident, according to popular accounts, was renovating his home and knocked through a wall, only to discover a hidden room that turned out to lead into the vast, largely forgotten network of tunnels and chambers beyond. A discovery that led to serious archaeological exploration and eventually to Derinkuyu being opened, in part, to visitors, revealing to the wider world just how extensive and sophisticated this underground city truly was. I think there's something worth sitting with as we get ready to leave this cool, quiet, lamplit underground world and move on to our next city. Derinkuyu represents a very different kind of human ingenuity than the great open mounds of Cahokia or the soaring stone walls of Great Zimbabwe. It's a monument not to power or wealth or trade, but to resilience, to a community's determination, generation after generation, to survive difficult and dangerous times by turning to the one resource that couldn't easily be taken from them: the solid rock beneath their own feet, patiently carved, level by level, into an entire hidden world. Beyond the residential levels and the chapels and the stables, Derinkuyu also included spaces dedicated to more specialized purposes, including what archaeologists believe was a winery, complete with stone basins carved for pressing grapes and channels cut to direct the juice into collection areas, along with similar facilities apparently used for pressing oil, likely from linseed, a crop well suited to the region's climate. Picture, for a moment, workers down in one of these lower levels during the grape harvest season, treading grapes barefoot in a shallow carved stone basin by lamplight, the sweet, slightly sharp smell of fresh grape juice mixing with that ever-present cool mineral smell of the surrounding rock, the juice running down carved channels toward a collection basin below, destined to become wine that would eventually be stored, quite possibly, in some of the many niches and storage chambers found throughout the complex. Ready for the day, however many weeks or months away, when the community above finally judged it safe to return to the sunlit world overhead. There's something worth noticing, too, in just how thoroughly domestic and unremarkable most of Derinkuyu's carved spaces actually were, despite the genuinely extraordinary nature of the place as a whole. Kitchens with soot-blackened ceilings from centuries of cooking fires. Simple storage niches worn smooth by generations of hands reaching in for grain or tools. Narrow connecting corridors polished slightly by the passage of countless feet over countless years. It's easy, hearing about an underground city carved through 18 levels, to imagine something grand or otherworldly. But the lived reality of the place, for the families who actually sheltered there, would have been made up mostly of these same small, practical, repeated details that fill any ordinary home, just arranged, this particular time, entirely underground, lit by oil lamps instead of daylight, and protected by half-ton stone doors that could be rolled shut against whatever danger waited in the world above. Let's rise back up now, back into open air and sunlight, and travel across the ocean once more, this time to the desert coast of northern Peru, to the largest city ever built out of mud brick anywhere in the ancient world. Chan Chan, the kingdom of mud and sea. I want you to imagine standing at the edge of a vast desert city on the northern coast of Peru, somewhere around the year 1400, near the modern city of Trujillo. In front of you stretches an enormous urban landscape, nearly 8 square miles of it, built almost entirely from adobe, sun-dried mud brick, its walls rising up out of the pale desert sand in great geometric compounds, some walls reaching 30 feet high, decorated along their upper sections with elaborate carved friezes depicting waves, fish, seabirds, and geometric patterns, all pressed into the wet mud and left to dry hard under the relentless coastal sun. This is Chan Chan, capital of the Chimu Kingdom, and it holds a genuinely remarkable distinction. It is the largest city ever built out of adobe mud brick anywhere in the world, at its height home to as many as 30,000 people, and possibly considerably more, making it one of the largest cities anywhere in the Americas before European contact, rivaled in this hemisphere really only by the great Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan far to the north. Let's go inside, and let's imagine what daily life looked like in a city built not of stone or wood, but of the desert's own earth, shaped by human hands and dried by the sun into something strong enough to last for centuries. The Chimu Kingdom rose to power along Peru's arid northern coast sometime around the year 900, eventually growing to control a long stretch of coastline extending for hundreds of miles, before ultimately being conquered by the expanding Inca Empire in the 1470s. This coastal strip of Peru is one of the driest deserts on Earth, and yet the Chimu built one of the great pre-Columbian civilizations here, and the secret to how they managed it lies in a resource most people wouldn't immediately think of when picturing desert life: water, carefully and ingeniously managed. The Chimu engineered an extensive system of irrigation canals, drawing water from rivers descending out of the Andes Mountains, and channeling it across many miles of otherwise barren desert, transforming it into productive farmland capable of supporting a huge population. Some of these canal systems stretched for over 40 miles, engineering feats that required a sophisticated understanding of gradient, water flow, and long-term planning that modern engineers still study with real admiration. Picture for a moment the sheer scale of labor and coordination this required. Generations of workers digging and maintaining these canals by hand, using simple wooden and stone tools, moving earth basket by basket much like the mound builders of Cahokia had, except here the goal wasn't a mound reaching toward the sky, but a channel reaching outward across the desert, coaxing life out of land that would otherwise remain barren sand. Let's imagine an ordinary evening within one of Chan Chan's great walled compounds, called ciudadlas by modern archaeologists, since we don't know the original Chimu name for them. There were 10 of these massive compounds within the city, each one a self-contained walled complex with its own residential quarters, storerooms, wells, and ceremonial spaces, and most archaeologists believe each ciudadla was built to house a single Chimu ruler during his lifetime, serving afterward as his mausoleum and a kind of ancestral shrine maintained by his descendants, a fascinating parallel, in some ways, to certain Egyptian traditions, though developed entirely independently on the other side of the world. Picture stepping through the single narrow entrance into one of these compounds, since each ciudadla had just one carefully controlled point of access, a detail that speaks to how much importance the Chimu placed on privacy, security, and controlled movement even within their own capital. Once inside, you'd find yourself moving through a maze-like series of courtyards and corridors, the tall adobe walls on either side blocking most direct sunlight and creating cool, shaded passages, a practical response to the intense coastal desert sun. The walls themselves, up close, are extraordinary, covered in places with those elaborate carved and molded friezes, repeating geometric patterns, stylized fish and seabirds, and images of what researchers believe may represent moon animals or mythological creatures tied to Chimu religious beliefs. Since the moon, rather than the sun, appears to have held the primary place of religious importance in Chimu cosmology, a striking contrast to many other ancient civilizations that centered their worship on the sun. I want you to imagine the particular smell and texture of this place. Adobe itself has a distinctive earthy smell, especially right after the region's rare rains, when the mud brick releases a scent not unlike wet clay pottery. Underfoot, the ground would have been swept earth or hard-packed clay, smoothed by generations of feet passing over the same courtyards. In the cooking areas, smoke from small fires would mix with the smell of fish, since the Chimu, living right along a rich stretch of Pacific coastline blessed with the cold, nutrient-rich waters of the Humboldt Current, relied heavily on seafood, anchovies, sardines, and larger fish, caught from small reed boats called cabalitos de tatora, still used by local fishermen along this same coast today. A genuinely remarkable continuity stretching back well over 1,000 years. Let's imagine a fisherman heading out at dawn on one of these narrow reed boats, paddling out through the cold morning mist that often rolls in off the Pacific along this coast. The boat itself shaped almost like a canoe, but made from bundled tatora reeds lashed tightly together. Light enough to be carried on a man's shoulders, but sturdy enough to handle the coastal swells. He'd paddle out past the surf line, sitting or kneeling astride the narrow vessel, casting a net or using a simple line, working the cold water for an hour or two before turning back toward shore as the morning sun began to burn through the mist. His catch destined for the markets and kitchens of Chan just a short distance inland. Back within the city, craftsmen worked in specialized quarters producing goods that made the Chimu famous throughout the Andean world, particularly metalwork. Chimu artisans were renowned for their skill working gold, silver, and especially a copper-gold alloy that Andean peoples called tumbaga, hammering and casting it into ornate ceremonial objects, jewelry, and ritual implements. Picture a workshop area within one of the ciudadelas. Several craftsmen seated on the ground working with small stone and copper tools, one carefully hammering a thin sheet of silver into shape, another working a small hearth fire hot enough to melt metal for casting. The fire tended carefully with a blowpipe or simple bellows, the air in this section of the compound carrying a faint metallic smell mixed with charcoal smoke, distinct from the fish and wood smoke smells common elsewhere in the city. Textile production was equally important here, and Chimu weavers produced elaborate cloth using cotton grown in the irrigated fields surrounding the city, as well as wool brought down from llama and alpaca herds kept in the highlands and traded to the coast. Picture a group of women seated together in a shaded courtyard, working backstrap looms, a weaving technique still used by indigenous communities across the Andes today. The steady rhythmic sound of the loom's batten striking against newly woven thread, thump, 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 a sound that would have filled courtyards throughout the city, day after day, as skilled weavers produced the elaborate, colorful textiles that the Chimu, like most Andean cultures, valued as highly as gold or silver. Cloth serving not just as clothing but as currency, tribute, and a marker of status and identity. I want you to pause here and think about how thoroughly organized and stratified Chimu society appears to have been, based on what archaeologists have pieced together. Unlike Cahokia, which seems to have had a somewhat less rigid social hierarchy, Chan's very architecture reflects a deeply structured society, with the elite living within those massive walled ciudadelas, surrounded by smaller elite residential compounds, while the majority of the city's ordinary working population, the fishermen, farmers, and craft laborers who actually produced the food and goods that sustained the kingdom, lived in simpler adjoining neighborhoods of smaller adobe structures spread across the city's outskirts, a physical layout that made the social order of Chimu life visible in the very geography of the city itself. As evening fell over Chan Chan, the whole enormous adobe city would have taken on a particular golden quality, the low coastal sun catching the pale walls and turning them a warm amber color, long shadows stretching across the courtyards and narrow passages between compounds. Cooking fires would begin appearing throughout the residential districts, the smell of fish stew and roasted maize drifting through the streets, mixing with the ever-present smell of the sea, since the Pacific Ocean was never more than a short walk away from anywhere in the city. Somewhere temple musicians might be practicing for an upcoming ceremony, the sound of panpipes, an instrument found throughout the ancient Andean world, carrying thin and reedy across the cooling evening air, a sound entirely unlike the drums of Cahokia or the chanting priests of Nan Madol, distinctly, recognizably Andean. The Chimu kingdom, and Chan Chan along with it, met its end not through slow environmental decline like Cahokia, nor through gradual social unraveling like Great Zimbabwe, but through conquest. In the 1470s, the rapidly expanding Inca Empire, pushing outward from its highland capital of Cusco under the ambitious Emperor Topa Inca Yupanqui, moved against the Chimu kingdom, and after a difficult campaign, succeeded in conquering it, bringing this last great independent coastal kingdom of Peru under Inca control just a few decades before the Spanish conquest would sweep away the Inca Empire in turn. The Inca, notably, didn't destroy Chan Chan outright. Instead, they absorbed much of the Chimu administrative and craft expertise into their own growing empire, reportedly relocating many of Chan Chan's most skilled metalworkers and other artisans to Cusco itself to work directly for the Inca state, a practice the Inca used elsewhere too, extracting valuable expertise from conquered peoples rather than simply erasing them. But the political heart of the Chimu kingdom was broken. Chan Chan's population gradually declined under Inca rule, and then declined further and more sharply after the Spanish conquest of the Andes in the 1530s, when Spanish looters, drawn by persistent rumors of enormous quantities of gold and silver buried within the ciudadelas, tunneled extensively into the site over the following centuries, searching for treasure, doing considerable damage to the ancient compounds in the process. What remained, though, endured remarkably well, given that it was built entirely from mud brick in a place that, fortunately for preservation purposes, almost never receives rain. The extreme aridity of Peru's northern coast, the very same dryness that had made the Chimu's irrigation engineering so essential to their survival in the first place, turned out to be the reason so much of Chan Chan's adobe architecture, including those extraordinary carved friezes, has survived into the present day at all, protected not by any human effort at preservation, but simply by the near-total absence of rain to wash the mud walls away. Today, Chan Chan is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and walking through the restored sections of the Tshuti Ciudadela, one of the best preserved of the 10 great compounds, you can still run your fingers along carved adobe friezes of fish and seabirds pressed into the mud more than 500 years ago, still stand within courtyards where Chimu nobility once walked, still feel, in the particular hush of that desert air. Something of what it must have been like to live in a city built entirely from the earth itself, in one of the driest places on the planet, sustained by human ingenuity, careful engineering, and 40 miles of hand-dug canals carrying mountain water down to a thirsty desert coast. There's one last detail about Chan Chan worth carrying with you before we move on tonight. Within several of the ciudadelas, archaeologists have identified sunken garden areas called walk-in wells, spaces dug down below the surrounding ground level to reach the natural water table, allowing the chimu to grow crops directly within these lowered garden plots, even in the heart of a desert city, without relying entirely on the irrigation canals feeding fields farther out on the periphery. Picture a small kitchen garden tucked into a corner of a royal compound, sunk several feet below the surrounding courtyard, its air noticeably cooler and more humid than the dry desert air above. Rows of vegetables and herbs growing in soil kept moist by its closeness to groundwater, tended quietly perhaps by an elderly gardener who had cared for this same small sunken plot for decades, kneeling in the cool shade at the bottom of the pit, patiently pulling weeds, while somewhere above, at ground level, the ordinary noise and heat of the wider city carried on without much regard for the small, quiet, green world he tended just a few feet below. Let's leave the warm coastal desert of Peru now and travel to somewhere much colder, much windier, and, in its own way, even more remarkable, a small stone village on a remote Scottish island that lay completely hidden beneath the sand for 4,000 years. Skara Brae, the village older than the pyramids. I want you to imagine standing on a windswept, treeless coastline on the Orkney Islands, off the northern tip of Scotland, sometime around 3100 BC. The wind here almost never really stops, carrying the smell of salt and cold sea air across low, rolling grassland, and in front of you, half sunk into a low grassy mound near the edge of a wide sandy bay called the Bay of Scale, is a small cluster of stone houses, connected to one another by narrow covered passageways. Their low, rounded roofs, probably made of turf laid over whalebone or driftwood rafters, blending so completely into the surrounding landscape that from a short distance, you might walk right past the entire settlement without realizing it was there at all. This is Skara Brae, and here's something worth sitting with quietly for a moment. This small stone village was already old, already lived in, generations before the first stones of the Great Pyramid of Giza were ever quarried in Egypt. It's older than Stonehenge, which lies not far away in relative terms on the British mainland. When we talk about ancient history, we very often mean things that happened 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. Skara Brae was inhabited roughly 5,000 years ago, and for a full 600 years after that, generation after generation of the same community living, cooking, sleeping, and raising children in these same small stone rooms, long before most of what we usually call ancient history had even begun. Let's go inside, quite literally, since one of the most remarkable things about Skara Brae is just how completely, vividly preserved its interior domestic details are, giving us an intimate window into Stone Age daily life that very few other sites anywhere in the world can offer. The reason Skara Brae survived so completely comes down to two things: stone and sand. This part of Orkney has very little timber, since the islands are largely treeless, swept by near-constant Atlantic winds that make tree growth difficult. So instead of building with wood, as most Stone Age communities across Britain did, the people of Skara Brae built almost everything from the flat, naturally fracturing local sandstone, which splits easily into thin slabs perfect for construction. And then, sometime after the village was eventually abandoned, probably around 2500 BC, a massive sandstorm, or more likely a series of storms over time, buried the entire settlement under thick layers of sand, sealing it, protecting it from erosion and disturbance for the next 4,000 years, until, remarkably, a severe storm in the winter of 1850 stripped away the covering sand and grass and exposed the ancient walls once more, revealing the site to a local landowner who began the first informal excavations. Let's imagine stepping down into one of the individual houses at Skara Brae during an ordinary winter evening, sometime around 3000 BC. You'd enter through a low doorway, having to duck your head, into a single roughly square room, perhaps 15 or 20 feet across, its stone walls curving gently inward as they rose, and its floor set down slightly below the surrounding ground level, which, along with those turf roofs, would have helped insulate the house against the harsh Orkney winter winds. In the center of the room sits a stone-built hearth, and this is where the entire life of the household would have revolved. Around the hearth, and this is one of the details that makes Skara Brae so extraordinary, are stone furnishings, built directly into the house itself using the same flat sandstone slabs as the walls, since without much timber available, the people here simply built their furniture from stone instead of wood. On either side of the hearth stand what archaeologists call box beds, low stone-sided enclosures that would originally have been lined with straw, heather, or animal skins for warmth and comfort. Essentially stone bed frames that have survived, intact, for 5,000 years. Against the wall opposite the door stands what's become one of the most famous single features of the entire site, a stone dresser, 2 tiers of shelving built directly into the wall, exactly the kind of furniture you might find in a farmhouse kitchen today, used, archaeologists believe, to display the household's most valued possessions, pottery, tools, perhaps decorative items, positioned so that anyone entering through the low doorway would see it immediately, directly across from the entrance. I want you to pause here and really picture that. A Stone Age family, 5,000 years ago, keeping a kind of display shelf for their nicer belongings, positioned deliberately where visitors would see it first. There's something so deeply, recognizably human about that impulse. Isn't there? The same instinct that makes people today put their best dishes on display, or keep the living room a little tidier for guests than the rooms further back in the house. Across 5,000 years, across a gulf of time that separates us from nearly everything we usually think of as ancient history, that particular human impulse, to take a little pride in your home, to want it to look nice for visitors, apparently hasn't changed much at all. Let's imagine an ordinary evening in this house. A small oil lamp, likely a simple stone bowl containing animal fat with a wick of moss or dried plant fiber, provides a small flickering circle of warm light, supplementing the glow from the central hearth fire, which burns a mixture of driftwood, since actual timber was scarce, along with dried seaweed, animal bone, and peat, a type of fuel formed from partially decayed plant matter that's still cut and burned in parts of Scotland and Ireland today. The smell inside would have been thick and particular, smoke from the peat fire, which has a distinctive, almost sweet, earthy smell quite different from wood smoke, mixed with the smell of cooking food and the ever-present must of damp stone and turf. Picture a woman preparing a meal at the hearth, using pottery vessels, since Skara Brae's residents made a distinctive style of pottery, now called grooved ware by archaeologists, decorated with incised geometric patterns, examples of which have been found throughout the site. Their diet here would have relied heavily on what the land and sea around them could provide. Cattle and sheep raised on the surrounding grassland, since Skara Brae's residents were farmers as well as gatherers, along with fish. Shellfish gathered along the nearby shore, limpets, crabs, and other seafood plentiful in the tidal pools of the Bay of Scale, and wild plants and berries gathered in season. Bones found throughout the site suggest cattle were particularly important, both for meat and quite possibly for milk. An analysis of the deposits found here shows that the people of Skara Brae ate remarkably well by Stone Age standards, with evidence suggesting a diet that was actually more varied and secure than many later, more advanced societies would enjoy. I want you to imagine the sound of the wind outside during a proper Orkney winter storm, since these islands, even today, experience some of the strongest, most consistent winds anywhere in the British Isles. Picture that low, constant howl and moan of wind pressing against the low turf-covered roof of the house, a sound so constant it likely became, over a lifetime, something residents barely consciously noticed anymore. Background noise the way distant traffic might be background noise for you now. Inside, though, protected by thick stone walls and that insulating layer of turf and earth packed around and over the structure, the house itself would have remained remarkably snug, the hearth fire providing warmth that the stone walls would help hold in, even while the wind screamed outside. One of the truly remarkable features of Skara Brae is that the individual houses weren't simply standing separately, exposed to the elements between them. They're connected to one another, and to a wider midden, essentially a mound of accumulated domestic waste, ash, shells, animal bone, and general debris, that built up around and between the houses over the centuries the village was occupied, by low, covered stone passageways, narrow enough that you'd likely have to stoop or even crawl through parts of them, but providing sheltered movement between houses without having to step out into the harsh Orkney weather at all. Picture a child, small enough to move easily through these low passages, scurrying from her own family's house over to a neighboring one to deliver a message or simply to visit, disappearing into the dark, narrow stone corridor, and emerging a few moments later into the warm, firelit interior of a different household, having never once stepped outside into the wind and cold. Let's think, for a moment, about what daily life beyond the house itself might have looked like here. Skara Brae's residents were skilled at working bone and stone into tools, and archaeologists have found evidence of both practical items, like bone needles used for sewing hides and early textiles, and more decorative or possibly ceremonial objects, including strange carved stone balls whose exact purpose remains genuinely uncertain, along with pieces of jewelry, including beads and pendants, suggesting that even in this remote, wind-battered corner of the Stone Age world, people still cared about personal adornment, still wanted to make and wear beautiful things, not purely for survival, but simply because it mattered to them. There's also intriguing evidence, found in one particular house, Structure 8, which was set apart somewhat from the others and appears to have served a different function than the residential houses, of what might have been craft or tool-making activity, along with unusual features that some archaeologists have suggested might indicate this building served some kind of specialized or possibly semi-ceremonial purpose within the small community, though, as with so much about this site, the truth is genuinely uncertain, pieced together carefully from physical evidence rather than any written record since, like the builders of Cahokia thousands of years later and thousands of miles away, the people of Skara Brae left behind no writing at all. Around the year 2500 BC, for reasons that still aren't entirely clear, though changing climate conditions and increasingly severe coastal storms are the leading theories among archaeologists, the people of Skara Brae left their village. It doesn't appear to have been sudden or violent. There's no evidence of a catastrophic ending, no signs of conflict or disaster sweeping through in a single moment. It looks once again like a pattern we've now seen play out again and again across very different corners of the ancient world tonight. A slow, unhurried departure, families gradually moving on, perhaps as the encroaching sand and increasingly harsh coastal conditions made the site less hospitable, until eventually the hearths went cold, and the stone dressers stood empty of the pottery and tools that had once been proudly displayed there. And the wind, that same constant Orkney wind that had always surrounded this small community, slowly buried the whole village under drifting sand, hiding it so completely and so thoroughly that it would remain essentially invisible, forgotten, for the next 4,000 years. And I think that particular detail is worth sitting with as we prepare to move on tonight. 4,000 years. For 4,000 years, this small, cozy, carefully furnished stone village sat completely hidden beneath the sand of that Orkney beach, its stone dressers and box beds and hearths preserved in near-perfect darkness and silence, while somewhere else entirely the pyramids of Egypt were built, and then grew ancient themselves, while entire civilizations rose in Mesopotamia and Greece and Rome, flourished and fell, while the Roman Empire came to Britain and eventually left again, while the Vikings, whose own later settlements are found elsewhere on these same Orkney Islands, arrived centuries after Skara Brae had already been buried and forgotten for longer than the entire span of recorded human history up to that point. All of that happened, everywhere else in the world, while this quiet little stone village simply sat beneath the sand, waiting, its stone furniture still arranged exactly as its last residents had left it, until a winter storm in 1850 finally uncovered it again. Today, if you visit Skara Brae, which sits within the heart of Neolithic Orkney UNESCO World Heritage Site, you can walk along a viewing path built above the excavated houses and look directly down into these 5,000-year-old rooms, seeing that famous stone dresser still standing in its original position, still positioned directly opposite the doorway of House 7, exactly where its long-forgotten owners placed it, so many thousands of years ago, to greet anyone who came calling. Before we leave Orkney, I want to sit with one more small, quiet detail about Skara Brae, something that has nothing to do with stone furniture or ancient diets, but that I find myself thinking about more than almost anything else from this particular city. In one of the houses, a small collection of what appear to be simple painted pebbles was found, along with other modest personal items tucked away carefully in storage niches, the sort of small, private belongings that don't serve any obvious practical purpose at all, and that archaeologists generally interpret as evidence of ordinary personal, or perhaps even sentimental value to whoever kept them. We'll never know exactly what those particular pebbles meant to the person who placed them there, whether they were a child's collected treasures, a keepsake connected to someone who had died, or something else entirely, lost now to us along with everything else about that individual person's inner life. But the fact that they kept them at all, tucked away safely in a small stone house on a wind-battered Scottish beach 5,000 years ago, tells us something true and lasting about the kind of creatures we've always been. People who, even in the deep Stone Age, even in the hardest and most physically demanding circumstances imaginable, still made room in their lives for small, quiet, personal things that mattered simply because they mattered, with no other explanation required at all. Let's leave the cold, windswept coast of Scotland now and travel south, far south, across an entire ocean to the high central plateau of Mexico, and the ruins of a city so enormous, so carefully planned that we still, even now, don't know what its own builders called themselves. Teotihuacan, the city without a name. I want you to imagine standing at the southern end of a very wide, very straight avenue, somewhere on the high central plateau of Mexico, not far from where modern Mexico City sits today, sometime around the year 300. The avenue stretches out in front of you for more than a mile and a half, running in an almost perfectly straight north-south line, flanked on either side by enormous stepped pyramid platforms and ceremonial complexes, and at its far northern end rises the Pyramid of the Moon, while off to your right, roughly a third of the way along the avenue, stands the truly massive bulk of the Pyramid of the Sun, at its base nearly as large as the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt, and originally, before centuries of erosion, standing well over 200 feet tall. This is Teotihuacan, and I want to start this final chapter tonight with something a little strange, something that sets this city apart from every other place we've visited so far. We don't actually know what the people who built this enormous city called themselves, or what they called their own home. The name Teotihuacan isn't their name at all. It's a name given to the site centuries later in the Nahuatl language by the Aztecs, who arrived in this valley long after Teotihuacan had already been abandoned and stood in ruins, and who were so awestruck by the sheer scale of the empty city, they found there that they named it Teotihuacan, generally translated as something like the place where the gods were born, or the place where men became gods, believing, according to their own traditions, that this was the very site where the sun and moon themselves had first been created. Let's go inside, and let's try to imagine a living, breathing version of what became, by the time the Aztecs found it centuries later, an empty, mythologized ruin. At its height, sometime between roughly 100 and 550 AD, Teotihuacan was almost certainly the largest city anywhere in the Americas, and one of the largest cities anywhere on Earth at that particular moment in history, home to a population that most researchers now estimate at somewhere between 125,000 and 200,000 people, which would have made it comparable in size to some of the largest cities in the Roman Empire at the very same time. Though the two civilizations, as far as we know, had no direct contact or awareness of one another at all, developing entirely independently on opposite sides of the world. The city was laid out according to an extraordinarily precise and deliberate urban plan, organized around that great central thoroughfare, which archaeologists later named the Avenue of the Dead, again a name given long after the fact, this time by the Aztecs, who mistook the many platform mounds lining the avenue for tombs. The entire city grid was oriented along a specific axis, slightly rotated from true north, an alignment that appears to have held deep astronomical and religious significance for its builders, possibly tied to the position of certain stars, or to the point on the horizon where the sun set on a particular significant date each year. A level of careful astronomical planning that speaks to a highly organized society with sophisticated knowledge of the sky above them, knowledge held, presumably, by a specialized class of priests and astronomers, and passed down carefully across generations. Let's imagine walking along the Avenue of the Dead on an ordinary market day, sometime around the year 400. The avenue itself would have been busy, filled with people moving in both directions. Priests in elaborate feathered and jade-adorned ceremonial dress moving between temple complexes. Ordinary residents going about daily errands, and merchants and their customers gathered in the marketplaces that occupied significant sections of the city. Teotihuacan sat at the center of an enormous trade network extending across much of Mesoamerica, and its marketplaces would have offered an extraordinary range of goods, obsidian tools and blades, since the city controlled nearby obsidian sources and became a major center of obsidian working and trade, along with cacao brought up from tropical lowland regions far to the south, brightly colored feathers, particularly the prized iridescent green feathers of the quetzal bird, cotton textiles, pottery and jade, much of it traded in from the distant Maya regions of what is now Guatemala and southern Mexico. Picture the sound and smell of one of these marketplaces on a busy morning. Vendors calling out, comparing and haggling over goods laid out on woven mats spread across the ground. The particular sharp, almost glassy smell of freshly worked obsidian mixing with the rich, earthy smell of cacao beans. And underneath everything, the smell of maize, since corn, much like at Cahokia on the other side of the world entirely, formed the true foundation of daily life and diet here too, ground into meal. Formed into flatbreads cooked on flat clay griddles called comils over open fires, a food so central to daily life that its preparation would have been one of the most constant, repeated domestic activities throughout the entire city, morning after morning, in household after household. Most of Teotihuacan's population lived not in grand temple complexes, but in what archaeologists call apartment compounds, a genuinely distinctive and remarkable feature of this city's urban planning that sets it apart from most other ancient cities anywhere in the world. Rather than individual freestanding houses scattered somewhat informally, as at Cahokia, or grand walled compounds housing single elite families, as at Chan Chan, the great majority of Teotihuacan's population, likely including both prosperous craftspeople and more modest laborers, lived together in large, walled, multi-family residential complexes, some housing as many as 60 to 100 people. Organized around small internal courtyards that let in light and air, while the solid outer walls of the compound presented a mostly blank face to the street outside, providing both privacy and, quite possibly, some measure of protection. Let's imagine stepping into one of these apartment compounds on a quiet afternoon. You'd pass through a single entrance into a world quite different from the busy avenue outside, a series of small interconnected courtyards, some open to the sky, providing light and ventilation to the rooms surrounding them. The walls of many rooms plastered smooth and in wealthier or more prominent compounds, painted with vivid murals in mineral pigments, red, ochre, deep blue-green, depicting religious and mythological scenes, processions of priests, images of gods and sacred animals, jaguars and serpents and richly dressed figures whose exact identities and stories, without any surviving written narrative to explain them, remain only partially understood by modern researchers, pieced together carefully through careful comparison with later Mesoamerican traditions, and through the patient, painstaking work of iconographic analysis. Picture a family living within one section of such a compound, their portion of the complex including a few small rooms opening onto a shared courtyard with several other related or connected households, perhaps an extended family group, or households connected through occupation, since evidence suggests some apartment compounds were organized around particular craft specializations, groups of related obsidian workers, for instance, or potters, living and working together in the same residential complex. Their trade knowledge and techniques passed down within the compound across generations. In the shared courtyard, children from several different households would play together, their voices carrying up into the open sky above the enclosed compound, while, along the edges of the courtyard, women might be grinding maize on stone grinding tools called metates, using a smaller handheld stone, called a mano, worked back and forth across the larger stone surface in a steady, practiced rhythm. That particular grinding sound, once again, echoing across so many of the cities we've visited tonight. From Cahokia to Great Zimbabwe to Teotihuacan, a sound so fundamental to daily human life across so much of the pre-industrial world that it seems to connect these otherwise entirely separate, unconnected civilizations across vast distances and centuries, all of them, independently, discovering the same basic rhythm of turning hard grain into soft meal by hand. I want you to pause here, just for a moment, and think about that. None of the 7 cities we've visited tonight had any contact with each other. Cahokia's builders never knew Great Zimbabwe existed. The people of Chan Chan had no idea that, on the far side of the world, families in Skara Brae had once ground their own grain by hand in stone houses buried beneath Scottish sand. And yet, again and again tonight, we found the same basic human rhythms repeating themselves. The grinding of grain, the tending of fire, the careful arrangement of a home to look presentable for visitors, the specialized craftsmen working quietly by lamplight, children playing while adults worked nearby. There's something genuinely moving about that, I think. The way human life, across every one of these radically different environments, desert coast and Pacific lagoon and underground refuge and windswept Scottish shore, kept arranging itself around the same essential needs and comforts, over and over again, entirely independently, all across the world. Religion permeated nearly every aspect of life in Teotihuacan, and the city's great pyramids and temple complexes served as the physical center of an elaborate religious system whose exact beliefs, again, we can only partially reconstruct, since Teotihuacan's own writing system, if it had a fully developed one at all, remains only partially understood, quite unlike the much better deciphered writing systems of the later Maya. What we do know, largely from careful archaeological excavation, is sobering in places. Excavations beneath the Pyramid of the Moon and the nearby Feathered Serpent Pyramid have revealed evidence of ritual human sacrifice connected to the construction and consecration of these major religious structures. Burials of individuals, some apparently high-status warriors or captives, arranged with weapons and ornaments, interred as part of dedicatory ceremonies when these massive structures were built or expanded, a practice that, however difficult it may be for us to fully understand from our own modern vantage point, held deep religious and cosmological meaning within Teotihuacan's own belief system, tied to ideas about maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the continued movement of the sun and the fertility of the earth. Concepts that would continue, in modified form, in later Mesoamerican civilizations, including the Aztecs themselves, who inherited and adapted many religious concepts from the older civilizations that had come before them in this same valley. Let's imagine, then, a major religious ceremony taking place at the base of the Pyramid of the Sun, on a significant date in the ceremonial calendar, perhaps timed to a solstice or some other astronomically significant moment that the city's careful north-south alignment may have been designed to mark. Crowds of residents would gather along the Great Avenue and in the plaza before the pyramid. Priests dressed in elaborate costume, feathered headdresses, jade ornaments, faces perhaps painted or masked, moving in careful procession up the pyramid's steep staircase toward a temple structure that would have once stood at its summit, long since lost to time. The air would carry the smell of copal incense, a tree resin burned throughout Mesoamerica for religious purposes, its distinctive sweet, slightly smoky fragrance drifting out over the crowded avenue, mixing with the sound of conch shell trumpets and drums, and the low murmur of thousands of voices gathered together, watching, participating, in a ceremony meant to maintain the proper order of the cosmos itself. Teotihuacan's influence extended, remarkably, far beyond the boundaries of the city itself. Archaeological evidence of Teotihuacan's distinctive art style, religious iconography, and even direct political influence has been found at Maya cities hundreds of miles away, including the great Maya city of Tikal in what is now Guatemala, where evidence suggests Teotihuacan may have played a direct role in a significant political transition around the year 378. An event some researchers have described as amounting to something like a conquest, or at least a very forceful political intervention, by Teotihuacan into Maya affairs, evidence of a city whose power and reach extended across a huge portion of ancient Mesoamerica, even though, again, we still don't know what its own rulers or its own people called their home or themselves. As the sun set over Teotihuacan on an ordinary evening, the Great Pyramids would catch the last golden light, their stepped profiles turning a deep warm orange red before fading into silhouette against the darkening sky, while, throughout the residential apartment compounds spread across the rest of the city, cooking fires would be lit. The smell of maize and beans, and for wealthier households, perhaps turkey or dog, both domesticated and eaten across much of ancient Mesoamerica, mixing together across the darkening city, while from somewhere near the Great Avenue, the sound of a conch shell trumpet might mark the close of the day's religious observances, a low, resonant note carrying out across the rooftops of a city that was, at that particular moment in history, one of the largest and most sophisticated urban centers anywhere on the planet. I want to spend just a little more time inside one particular apartment compound before we move on, a compound called Tepentitla, since the paintings preserved on its walls offer some of the clearest surviving windows we have into how Teotihuacan's own residents understood their world and their gods. One of the murals found here, badly damaged in places but still remarkably legible, depicts a scene many researchers have interpreted as a representation of paradise, a lush, watery garden landscape filled with small human figures, singing, playing, chasing butterflies, and swimming, presided over by a large, elaborately dressed central figure long associated with a deity later known to the Aztecs as Tlaloc, a god connected to rain, water, and fertility. Though some scholars have more recently suggested the imagery may represent Teotihuacan's own Great Mother Goddess, or a paradise associated with the mountain itself, since certainty here remains genuinely difficult given the absence of any surviving written explanation from Teotihuacan's own people. Picture a family living in this particular compound walking past that painted wall every single day. The bright mineral pigments, reds and blues, and a distinctive water-associated turquoise green, catching the light differently depending on the hour. The small painted figures in their garden becoming, over years of familiarity, less something actively noticed, and more simply part of the comfortable, expected backdrop of home. The way a piece of art hung in a hallway you pass through every day eventually becomes something you see without quite looking at anymore, present and comforting all the same. And then, sometime around the year 550, Teotihuacan's long story came to an end. And this ending, unlike most of the others we've discussed tonight, does appear to have involved real violence and real destruction, at least in its final phase. Archaeological evidence shows that many of the city's major religious and political structures along the Avenue of the Dead were deliberately burned and destroyed during this period, statues broken, temples set ablaze, in what researchers generally interpret as evidence of significant internal upheaval, quite possibly an uprising by Teotihuacan's own population against its ruling elite, rather than an invasion by an outside enemy. Since the destruction appears to have been concentrated specifically on structures and monuments associated with political and religious authority, while many of the ordinary residential apartment compounds elsewhere in the city show comparatively little destruction from this same period, a pattern that suggests targeted, deliberate action against symbols of power, rather than indiscriminate warfare sweeping through the entire city. Whatever the precise sequence of events, and there remains real scholarly debate about the exact causes, some pointing to a combination of factors including drought, agricultural strain from supporting such an enormous population for centuries, and long-simmering internal political tensions finally reaching a breaking point. The effect was the same as we've seen echo across so many of tonight's cities. Population decline, gradual abandonment, until the great avenue that had once been crowded with priests and merchants and ordinary families stood empty, and the apartment compounds fell silent, and grass and eventually brush grew up across a city that had recently housed a population comparable to some of the largest cities in the Roman world. I want to mention one more remarkable feature of Teotihuacan before we leave, something discovered fairly recently that adds yet another layer to how carefully planned this city truly was. In 2003, following heavy rains, a sinkhole opened up near the base of the Feathered Serpent Pyramid, revealing the entrance to a long tunnel running deep beneath the structure, deliberately carved and sealed in ancient times. Archaeologists who have spent years now carefully excavating that tunnel, working by artificial light through passages that had remained completely undisturbed for roughly 1,800 years, have found thousands of ritual objects left as offerings along its length: jade figurines, pyrite mirrors, carved shells, and even small spheres coated in a mineral pigment that shimmers like liquid metal, along with pools of liquid mercury pooled deliberately at points along the tunnel floor, possibly meant to represent an underworld river or lake in the city's cosmology. Picture the priests who once processed down into that tunnel by torchlight, centuries before it was deliberately sealed, moving through absolute darkness except for their own carried flame, placing offering after offering along a passage built to represent, quite possibly, the watery underworld itself, a journey undertaken with real solemnity, in service of a religious cosmology we can now only partially reconstruct, using evidence that sat completely undisturbed, sealed away in the dark, for nearly 2,000 years, until a rainstorm finally opened a way back in. For the next several centuries, Teotihuacan stood as a vast, mysterious ruin, and it was during this period, long after the city's original builders and their descendants had scattered or been fully absorbed into other emerging societies across the central Mexican valley, that later peoples, including eventually the Aztecs, arriving in this valley centuries afterward, encountered the enormous empty pyramids and avenues, and much like European settlers encountering Cahokia's mounds, or explorers encountering Great Zimbabwe's stone walls, found themselves unable to imagine that ordinary human builders, disconnected from their own experience and understanding, could have created something so vast and so impressive, and so, instead, wove it into their own religious mythology, naming it Teotihuacan, the birthplace of the gods, and continuing to visit and venerate the ruins as a sacred site even as they built their own great capital, Tenochtitlan, on an island in a nearby lake, a city that would itself, generations later, be conquered and largely destroyed by Spanish conquistadors, becoming the foundation, quite literally, of modern Mexico City. Today, Teotihuacan is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the Americas, and if you climb the Pyramid of the Sun, following the same steep staircase that priests once processed up during those ancient ceremonies we imagined a moment ago, you can stand at the summit and look out over the entire Avenue of the Dead, stretching out before you in that same careful, deliberate north-south alignment its builders laid out nearly 2,000 years ago, the Pyramid of the Moon rising at the far end. And all around, spreading out beyond the excavated ceremonial core, the low grassy mounds that mark where thousands of apartment compounds once stood, homes to 100,000 people or more, people who ground their maize by hand in shared courtyards, who painted their walls with images of gods whose names we still don't fully know, who built one of the great cities of the ancient world, and who left behind no name for themselves at all, only the overwhelming physical evidence of everything they built. Patient and enormous and silent, waiting nearly 1,500 years for us to try, imperfectly, to imagine our way back into their ordinary, extraordinary lives. What happens after a city dies? We've traveled a long way together tonight. From the earthen mounds of the Mississippi floodplain to the stone walls of southern Africa, out over the lagoon waters of the Pacific, down into the cool volcanic dark beneath central Turkey, across the sun-baked adobe streets of coastal Peru, along the windswept, buried shoreline of a Scottish island, and finally through the great stone avenues of a Mexican city whose true name we may never actually know. 7 cities. 7 different corners of the world. 7 entirely different building materials, entirely different climates, entirely different religions and political systems and daily rhythms of life. And yet, if you've been drifting in and out of sleep along with me tonight, I imagine you've noticed something these places all had in common, something quieter and more universal than any of their individual differences. Before we get to that, I just want to check in with you again for a moment, the way we did earlier tonight. If you're still with me, still awake enough to be listening, I hope you're warm and comfortable and settling deeper into sleep with every passing minute. Wherever you're lying tonight, in whatever city or town, in whatever time zone, I like picturing all of you scattered out there in the dark right now, half listening, half dreaming already, carried along by these old, forgotten places. If a thought crosses your mind about which of these 7 cities you'd most want to have actually seen, back when it was alive and full of ordinary people going about their evenings, I'd genuinely love to know, whenever you get the chance to tell me, down in the comments below. For now, though, you don't need to do anything at all. Just keep listening and let your body get heavier and let your breathing slow down. Here's the thing I keep coming back to, thinking about all 7 of these places together. Every single one of them, without exception, was, at its height, an entirely ordinary place to the people who lived there. I think that's easy to forget when we talk about ancient civilizations and lost cities, language that makes these places sound remote, mythical, almost unreal. But nobody living in Cahokia in the year 1100 thought of themselves as living in an ancient civilization. They thought of themselves as living in their city on an ordinary Tuesday, worrying about whether the corn harvest would be good enough this year, irritated that their neighbor's dog kept getting into their garden, looking forward to a particular meal, missing someone who had died, hoping their children would grow up strong and healthy. The same was true in Great Zimbabwe, and Nan Madol and Derinkuyu, and Chan and Skara Brae and Teotihuacan. Every one of these places was, to the people actually living in them, simply home. Simply the ordinary backdrop of an ordinary life, filled with small joys and small frustrations, in exactly the way your own city is the ordinary backdrop of your own life tonight. And every single one of these cities, eventually, stopped being anyone's home at all. I want to think for a few minutes about how that actually happens, because I think there's something genuinely worth understanding here. Something that isn't really about ancient history at all, but about the nature of change itself, and about how slowly, how gently most great transformations actually unfold, even the ones that look, centuries later, like dramatic endings. Notice that in almost every single case tonight, the actual process of a city's decline wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single battle, a single fire, a single catastrophe that emptied these places out in an afternoon. Teotihuacan came closest to that kind of dramatic ending, with real evidence of deliberate destruction in its final phase. But even there, that destruction appears to have come after generations of mounting strain, drought, and internal tension. A breaking point reached only after a long, slow accumulation of pressure. For the other 6 cities we visited tonight, the pattern was even gentler. Soil gradually wearing thin from generations of intensive farming, trade routes gradually shifting to favor some other rising city instead, climate gradually growing less reliable, political power gradually reorganizing itself around some new center. Families didn't wake up one morning and abandon their homes in a single dramatic exodus. They left the way people still leave declining towns today, gradually, one household at a time, over years and then decades, each individual family making its own quiet, practical decision about where opportunity and safety seemed to lie, until enough families had made that same choice that the city itself, almost without anyone quite intending it, simply stopped being a city anymore. I find something strangely comforting in that, actually. Not the loss itself, which is real and worth sitting with honestly, but the gentleness of it. These weren't stories of overnight catastrophe for the most part. They were stories of adaptation, of ordinary people making reasonable choices, generation after generation, in response to slowly changing circumstances, choices that, added together across an entire population over enough years, eventually reshaped the map entirely. There's something almost geological about it, the way a river slowly changes course over centuries, not through any single dramatic flood, but through countless small shifts in current and sediment, each one unremarkable on its own, until one day the river simply isn't where it used to be anymore. And then comes the part of the story that I think is, in its own way, even more interesting than the decline itself. What happens to a place after everyone has finally left? At first, not much changes at all. The houses stand empty but intact. Someone walking through Cahokia's central plaza the year after the last families departed would have found streets and mounds and the shells of houses, quiet but still recognizably a city, just an empty one. It's only with the slow passage of years, and then decades and then centuries, that a settled place gradually becomes something else. Thatched and timber roofs, unmaintained, begin to sag and eventually collapse. Rain and wind work steadily at unmortared stone and sun-dried mud brick alike, patiently wearing down walls that once stood sharp and freshly built. Grass and, in wetter climates, eventually trees, begin reclaiming courtyards and plazas that had been kept clear and swept for generations, their roots working slowly, persistently, into gaps between stones and bricks, doing over the course of centuries what no army could accomplish in a single season, gradually taking the whole structure apart, piece by patient piece. In some cases, the process is dramatically sped up or dramatically slowed down by unusual local conditions, and this is part of why the 7 cities we visited tonight look so different from one another today. Skara Brae was buried almost immediately, geologically speaking, under drifting sand, which paradoxically protected it far better than if it had simply been left exposed to Orkney's harsh weather, preserving even fragile interior details, like that famous stone dresser, that would otherwise have been lost entirely within a generation or two of abandonment. Chan Chan survived remarkably well specifically because it sits in one of the driest deserts on Earth, a place where the rain that destroys most mud brick architecture within a few centuries simply almost never falls at all. Nan Madol, by contrast, sits in one of the wettest, most biologically aggressive environments imaginable, a tropical lagoon where mangrove roots and constant moisture work quickly and relentlessly against even massive basalt stonework, which is part of why that site faces such urgent modern conservation challenges today. And then, eventually, if conditions and time allow, comes rediscovery. And I think it's worth noticing, as we sit with all 7 of these stories together, how strikingly similar the pattern of rediscovery tends to be, again and again, across completely unconnected parts of the world. In case after case tonight, when later peoples, whether local communities who had simply lost detailed knowledge of a site's origins, or, more often and more troublingly, European colonizers and explorers arriving centuries later, encountered these abandoned cities, the very first instinct was almost never to simply ask, calmly and respectfully, who built this, and why. The first instinct, again and again, was disbelief. Surely ordinary people, especially ordinary people who didn't look like the person doing the encountering, couldn't have built something this impressive. There must be some other explanation. Lost tribes, foreign visitors, divine intervention, mythical golden ages populated by beings greater than ordinary humans. We saw this most starkly with Great Zimbabwe, where that disbelief hardened into a deliberate, politically convenient falsehood, actively maintained by a colonial government for the better part of a century, specifically because acknowledging the truth would have undermined the entire justification for colonial rule in the region. But you can see echoes of that same instinctive disbelief in how European settlers initially responded to Cahokia's mounds, inventing elaborate theories about vanished races of mound builders, rather than simply crediting the ancestors of Native American communities who were, in many cases, still living in the region at the time. You can see it in how the Aztecs themselves, centuries removed from Teotihuacan's builders but still human beings looking at an enormous unexplained ruin, reached for mythology rather than mundane historical explanation, deciding this must be where the gods themselves were born, rather than simply the achievement of ordinary human ancestors whose direct memory had, by that point, genuinely been lost. I think there's a real lesson buried in that pattern, something worth carrying with you even after tonight's stories fade from memory. We are, it seems, as a species, chronically prone to underestimating what ordinary people, working together, patiently, over generations without any of our modern tools or technology, were actually capable of achieving. Basket by basket of earth at Cahokia, stone by carefully fitted stone at Great Zimbabwe, 50-ton column by 50-ton column at Nan Madol, level by careful level, carved by hand into solid volcanic rock at Derinkuyu, canal by 40-mile canal, dug through desert sand at Chan Chan, wall by wall, carefully fitted from local sandstone against the relentless Orkney wind at Skara Brae, pyramid by enormous, precisely aligned pyramid at Teotihuacan. None of these places required lost civilizations or ancient aliens or forgotten super technologies to explain them. They required exactly what actually built them: ordinary human patience, ordinary human ingenuity, and enormous amounts of ordinary, unglamorous, generation-spanning labor, performed by people who, in nearly every single case, remain almost entirely anonymous to us now, their individual names lost, even while the astonishing physical evidence of their combined effort still stands, waiting quietly in fields and lagoons and deserts and buried beneath sand, for us to notice it, and to finally give them the credit they deserved all along. I want you to think, one more time tonight, about the particular sounds we imagine together in each of these places. The steady grinding of corn at Cahokia, the soft huffing of cattle settling into their crawls at Great Zimbabwe, the quiet dip of a paddle in still lagoon water at Nan Madol, the clicking of a hammer on soft volcanic rock, carving room after room into the earth at Derinkuyu, the rhythmic thump of a backstrap loom at Chan Chan, the howl of Atlantic wind pressing against a turf roof at Skara Brae, the low resonant note of a conch shell trumpet drifting over rooftops at Teotihuacan. 7 different sounds, 7 different cities, 7 different centuries and continents and languages and beliefs. And underneath every single one of them, the same basic, unchanging human project: build a shelter, feed your family, care for your elders, teach your children, mark the changing seasons with ceremony and meaning, and try, in whatever way your particular culture understood it, to live a good life, in the brief window of time you happen to be given. Every single person who ever lived in these 7 cities is gone now. Every single one. The craftsman hammering copper at Cahokia, the priest chanting beneath the soapstone birds at Great Zimbabwe, the fisherman paddling out through morning mist near Nan Madol, the mother telling her frightened children a story deep underground at Derinkuyu, the weaver working her loom in a shaded Chan Chan courtyard, the woman arranging her best pottery on a stone dresser at Skara Brae, the family grinding maize together in a Teotihuacan courtyard. All of them lived out entire, complete human lives, full of everything a human life contains, and all of them have been gone now for anywhere from 500 to 5,000 years. And yet here we are tonight on the other side of all that time, still thinking about them, still trying carefully and respectfully to imagine our way back into their ordinary evenings, still in some small way, keeping a part of them alive simply by remembering that they existed at all, that they mattered, that their lives, however distant and different from our own, were every bit as real and as full and as complicated as yours is right now, lying there in the dark, listening to this old, slow story about all the forgotten places that came before whatever place you happen to call home tonight. A few more cities the world let go. Before we close things out tonight, I want to drift, more lightly now, through a handful of other forgotten cities, places that deserve their own full evening someday, but that I think you should at least fall asleep knowing existed. Let your mind wander loosely through these next few scenes. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just let the images pass by, like scenery out a train window at night. Let's start underwater, off the southern coast of Greece, near a place called Pavloptri, in the shallow, clear waters of the Peloponnese. Somewhere around 3,500 years ago, this was a real, functioning Bronze Age town, with streets laid out in an organized grid, courtyard houses, and what appear to have been public buildings and even tombs, all built on what was then dry coastal land. But over the following millennia, a combination of earthquakes and slowly rising sea levels submerged the entire settlement. And today, if you snorkel out over that stretch of clear Mediterranean water, you can actually look down through the surface and see the outlines of ancient streets and building foundations still resting on the seabed. A whole quiet town, roofless and silent, gently swayed by the same tide that once lapped at its harbor. Fish now drifting through doorways where Bronze Age families once passed in and out on ordinary afternoons. Let's move now to eastern Turkey, near the modern border with Armenia, to a place called Ani, sometimes called the City of 1,001 Churches. 1,000 years ago, Ani was a genuinely major medieval city, the capital of the Armenian Bagratid Kingdom, a wealthy hub along important trade routes, home to perhaps 100,000 people at its height, filled, as its nickname suggests, with an extraordinary number of churches, cathedrals, and monasteries, their domes and carved facades once dominating a dramatic skyline set on a high plateau above a deep river gorge. Invasions, earthquakes, and a slow diversion of trade routes away from the city gradually emptied it out over the following centuries, until by the 1700s, Ani had become almost entirely abandoned, a genuine ghost city, its churches standing roofless and empty on a windswept, largely uninhabited plateau, still standing there today, a haunting, mostly silent skyline of medieval stone, visited now mainly by historians, photographers, and travelers willing to make the long journey out to this remote corner of eastern Turkey. Let's cross the Atlantic now, back to American soil, to the high desert canyons of what is now southwestern Colorado, to a place called Mesa Verde. Beginning around the year 600 and continuing for roughly 700 years, the ancestral Puebloan people built an extraordinary series of settlements here, including, in the final century or so before the region was abandoned, remarkable cliff dwellings, entire multi-story stone villages built directly into natural alcoves in the canyon walls, accessible only by climbing carved handholds and ladders up the sheer rock face. Picture Cliff Palace, the largest of these dwellings, tucked beneath an overhanging cliff, its stone walls and small square towers nestled together in the natural shadow of the rock above, smoke from evening cooking fires drifting up and curling along the underside of that great stone overhang, while, above and below the alcove, farmers tended fields of corn, beans, and squash on the mesa top and in the canyon bottom. Around the year 1300, following decades of prolonged drought that researchers have confirmed through careful analysis of tree ring records, the ancestral Puebloan people gradually left Mesa Verde, migrating south and east toward the Rio Grande Valley and the Hopi mesas of what is now Arizona, where their descendants live to this day, carrying with them, across 7 centuries since, living oral traditions about the canyon, homes their ancestors eventually chose to leave behind. Let's cross the Atlantic once more, this time northward, to the windswept tip of Newfoundland in Canada, to a small, quiet site called L'Anse aux Meadows. Here, around the year 1000, a small group of Norse settlers, Vikings, sailing out from Greenland under leaders whose names appear in later Icelandic sagas, including possibly Leif Erikson himself, established a small settlement, the only confirmed Norse site anywhere in North America, and clear physical proof, discovered only in the 1960s, that Europeans had reached this continent nearly 500 years before Columbus. Picture a handful of turf-walled longhouses, their low, sod-covered roofs blending into the cold coastal landscape, much like the houses of Skara Brae had blended into their own Scottish shoreline, smoke rising from central hearths, a small forge where iron nails and rivets were worked for boat repair, and Norse sailors, far from home, looking out over unfamiliar northern coastline, gathering wild grapes and butternuts from farther south, evidence preserved in the archaeological record. That they explored considerably beyond this small toehold settlement itself. The site was used only briefly, likely just a handful of years, before being abandoned entirely, its Norse residents sailing back to Greenland and Iceland, leaving behind no lasting European presence in North America until Columbus's voyages centuries later, and leaving this small, quiet settlement to be reclaimed by grass and wind, forgotten so completely that its rediscovery in 1960 came as a genuine historical revelation. And let's end this quieter, wandering chapter back in North Africa, near the coast of modern Tunisia, with Carthage, once one of the greatest cities of the entire ancient Mediterranean world, founded, according to tradition, by Phoenician settlers from the eastern Mediterranean sometime in the 9th century BC, and growing over the following centuries into a maritime and trading power that rivaled, and eventually fought, the rising Roman Republic itself, across the long, brutal series of conflicts historians call the Punic Wars. At its height, Carthage was a sophisticated, wealthy city of considerable size, with its own distinctive harbors, including a remarkable circular naval harbor designed to house and protect its war fleet, its own writing system, religion, and culture, genuinely rivaling Rome in wealth and ambition. But after Rome's final, devastating victory in the Third Punic War in 146 BC, the city was deliberately destroyed, its buildings razed, and according to later tradition, though this particular detail is now considered likely exaggerated by ancient sources rather than strictly factual, its fields supposedly sown with salt to prevent anything from growing there again. Rome eventually rebuilt a new Roman city on the same site, but the original Carthage, the great Phoenician trading power that had once nearly changed the entire course of Mediterranean history, was gone, its own written records and literature almost entirely destroyed along with the city itself, leaving historians ever since to reconstruct its story largely through the eyes of its old enemy, Rome, a genuinely rare case among tonight's cities where a great city's ending really was sudden, and really was deliberate, and really was as close to total erasure as any ancient power ever managed to achieve. 5 more cities, then, drifting briefly through the edges of your mind tonight, alongside the 7 we explored more fully. A submerged Bronze Age town off the Greek coast, 1,000 roofless churches on a lonely Turkish plateau, stone villages tucked into the cliffs of the American Southwest, a handful of Viking longhouses on the edge of a Canadian meadow, and a great Phoenician trading city, silenced deliberately by Rome, its true voice lost to us now except through the words of the very enemies who destroyed it. The Last Watch. Let's imagine one final scene together before we close things out tonight. And this time, I don't want you to picture any single city in particular. I want you to imagine something more like a slow, drifting view from very high above, the kind of view you might have if you could somehow float, unhurried, above the whole surface of the earth, moving gently across centuries the way clouds move across a summer sky. Picture, somewhere below you, a fire burning low in a house at Cahokia, its last coals glowing orange in the dark, a family long since asleep on woven mats, their breathing slow, and even while outside, the great mound rises silent against a sky thick with stars, uncomplicated by any light except moonlight and hearth glow, since there was, of course, no other kind of light anywhere on Earth back then. Drift a little further, and picture cattle shifting quietly in their crawls below the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, the whole valley hushed, gold and cloth resting somewhere in a storeroom, waiting for tomorrow's trade caravan to carry it onward toward the coast. Drift out over open ocean, and picture moonlight on the still lagoon water surrounding Nan Madol, the massive basalt walls throwing long shadows across the channels, a single canoe drawn up quietly against a stone landing, its owner already asleep somewhere inside. Drift down, this time beneath the earth itself, into the hushed, lamplit corridors of Derinkuyu, where somewhere deep below the Cappadocian countryside, a family sleeps close together in a carved stone room, safe, for tonight at least, from whatever danger sent them underground in the first place. Drift back up into open air, out over the pale desert walls of Chan Chan, moonlight catching the carved friezes of fish and waves, the sound of the distant Pacific surf carrying faintly across the sleeping city. Drift north and west, over cold Atlantic water, to a small cluster of stone houses half sunk into a grassy mound on a Scottish beach, wind pressing steadily against low turf roofs, a family curled together in a stone box bed, warm despite the storm outside. And drift south again to the great dark silhouette of the Pyramid of the Sun, rising over a sleeping Mexican city, its apartment compounds hushed, its avenues empty except for, perhaps, a single night watchman standing quiet duty somewhere along that long straight road, looking up, the way people everywhere have always looked up, at exactly the same stars you might be able to see tonight if your own eyes were open right now instead of closed. Every one of those nights actually happened. Every single one of those quiet, ordinary, forgotten evenings, in cities that no longer exist, actually took place, exactly once, a very long time ago, and was never repeated in exactly that way again. And I think that's really what I want to leave you with tonight, more than any particular fact about mounds or stone walls or underground cities. Every single night in every single one of these places, for as long as they were inhabited, was somebody's ordinary evening. Somebody's forgettable Tuesday. Somebody tired, ready for sleep, thinking about tomorrow's chores, or a small worry, or someone they loved, in a house that felt to them as familiar and unremarkable as your own house feels to you right now. None of them knew, of course, lying down to sleep on any particular unremarkable night, whether their city would still be standing in 500 years, or would already be empty and quiet by then, waiting for sand or grass or jungle to slowly close back over it. They couldn't have known. Nobody ever really can. Nobody in any city on any given ordinary evening, tucking their children in, banking their fire for the night, ever really knows how their own story or their city's story will eventually end, or when, or how long it will be remembered afterward, or by whom. And maybe there's something quietly reassuring in that too in the end, because it means the not knowing was never really the point. The point, if there was one, was simply the evening itself, the fire. The meal, the particular quality of that day's tiredness, finally allowed to rest, the people you loved close by, breathing evenly in the dark beside you. That was true in Cahokia and Great Zimbabwe and Nan Madol and Derinkuyu and Chan and Skara Brae and Teotihuacan. And it's true tonight. Wherever you happen to be lying right now, in whatever city will, someday, centuries or millennia from now, have its own forgotten story told by someone else, in some language not yet invented, describing some version of tonight that neither of us can possibly imagine. For now, though, none of that matters. For now, there's only this quiet, ordinary evening, yours tonight, real and unremarkable and complete in itself, exactly the way every one of those ancient evenings once was too. If you're still awake enough to hear this last part, thank you genuinely for spending these hours with me tonight, drifting through 7, or really 12, forgotten cities scattered across nearly 5,000 years and every inhabited continent on Earth. If any part of tonight's story helped carry you towards sleep, that was really the whole purpose of it, more than any particular fact or date. History, when you slow it down enough, when you set aside the wars and the kings and the dramatic turning points that usually get all the attention, turns out to be made up mostly of these quiet, repeating evenings, fires being lit, meals being shared, children being tucked in, exactly like tonight, over and over again, in city after city after city, across every corner of the world. If you enjoyed tonight's journey through these forgotten places, and you'd like to fall asleep to more stories like this one, I'd be really grateful if you considered subscribing, so these long, slow histories can keep finding their way to you, night after night, whenever you need a little help drifting off. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps this quiet little channel keep going. And if you have a moment before sleep finally takes you, I'd love to hear, down in the comments, which of tonight's forgotten cities stayed with you the most. The mounds of Cahokia, the stone walls of Great Zimbabwe, the floating city of Nan Madol, the underground world of Derinkuyu, the desert kingdom of Chan, the buried village of Skara Brae, or the nameless grandeur of Teotihuacan. And if you'd like, tell me too, one more time, where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are, so that, wherever this recording finds you, I can imagine you there, settling in, letting go of the day in a city that is, right now, every bit as real and as full of quiet, ordinary life as any of the great forgotten cities we visited together tonight. Sleep well, buddy. I'll see you next time with another slow, quiet story whenever you're ready to drift off again.